mean, I gotta be honest, I don't even know where to start talking about any of this.
Yeah, I know. I had such a hard time trying to contextualize the DLC to begin with over the last month, and sitting down to like write show notes and prepare for this, has been the most chaotic thing of all time regarding my thought process regarding FromSoft games. Period. Like basically, what it is like trying to contextualize an entire game for the scale that Shadow of the Erdtree is at, contextualize an entire game into a DLC, and then compare that to the base game, Elden Ring, which is the most insane FromSoft game of all time. It's almost like we're working on two different like levels brain-wise. Our brains are splitting in half to like contextualize Shadow of the Erdtree within the base game, but also just trying to contextualize Shadow of the Erdtree in and of itself. So I feel for you.
Right, and I feel like a lot of the previous chats we've had about these games, there's some kind of chronology that it makes sense to follow. And here, I can imagine we could probably start, really high up, 40,000 feet or whatever, and just kind of start zooming into things we most want to talk about or find interesting or things we want to scrutinize. But I realized I put about, I think, 75 hours into my one playthrough of Shadow of the Erdtree. So I've only played through it once. It was a very thorough playthrough, though, and I was very blind for it for the most part. And then only after completing the playthrough, I did a little bit of sleuthing online, got a sense of maybe a few cosmetic items or weapons or something like that I might have missed that were actually locked behind sort of a different path and a quest line that I would have been locked out of because of decisions I made or something. So I'm kind of at that point where it's like, okay, I think it's probably time to start gearing up for playthrough 2, and I'll try to nab a few of those items that I didn't get this time around, and do a few things differently with NPCs and stuff. But I feel like I got a pretty good taste of like everything FromSoft put into this. Yet technically you only need to beat like 3 bosses to finish Shadow of the Erdtree. Everybody but Messmer, Romina, and Promised Radahn can be skipped, and a couple of them it's like, wait, I thought this was mandatory, and it's like, no, it's actually, there's workarounds and stuff. So that's the funny thing. It to me feels like Elden Ring 2. It feels like had they marketed this and put this out as a full-length game, called it Elden Ring 2, I don't think many people would have been very disappointed. It might have been just a tad shorter than the base game, but basically just feels like a sequel to me that they decided to sell at a discount and call it an expansion. Yet there's only 3 mandatory bosses, so it's I know like you and I talked about that many moons ago, that one person's playthrough could vary so dramatically from another person's playthrough with the base game, and I feel like that's totally true with Shadow of the Erdtree as well.
I completely agree, and I guess to maybe contextualize my experiences a bit more, I have beaten it 3 times already, and obviously the first being the most intensive, and like you were saying, really trying to avoid guides and just really be a part of this new world, the Land of Shadow. And I absolutely loved it. But of course I had to go in and I was like, okay, I beat all these bosses. I need to experience them a second time. So I did another playthrough. And then I went through it again, beat all like the main bosses more or less. Found a couple dungeons I hadn't, used a completely different build. So my first build was Faith Strength. My second build was Sorcery Dex. And then I realized, well, I haven't really dabbled with Arcane. And I have a character that's pure arcane, and not only pure arcane, but it's a Moog Spear only build. So my third playthrough was I wanted to test and see, and we'll obviously get into the Shadow Tree Blessing and kind of like what that scaling system does for the experience of playing through the DLC, but I wanted to see what a more or less speed run of the DLC would feel like, and just trying to hit all the bosses and not really do too much. I wanted to just defeat all the Remembrance bosses in a pretty linear form, and that was really fun. A Moog Spear, you can't go wrong, right? So we did a Moog Spear to kind of cap off my experience.
Maybe a thematically appropriate weapon too, like you defeat Moog, you enter the Shadow Realm, you got Moog's Spear. I like that.
Yeah, exactly. It was a thematic kind of cherry on top run to this first, I guess, run through the DLC for me, which I really enjoyed over the past month. yeah, I've been really eager to talk to you about. So I'm glad we're finally here. We're finally talking about Shadow of the Erdtree together.
Yeah, likewise. Maybe let's just do like a quick summary of just our feelings about it, and then we can start like digging into pieces and parts of it. Like we can talk a little bit about like the story of Shadow of the Erdtree and some of the we learn quite a bit that colors the base game pretty differently. We obviously a lot of bosses, a lot of new music, a lot of just lots of cool ingredients that we can dig into. But maybe let's just do like overall gut feelings, that kind of thing, especially because you've gone through it 3 times now. I'm curious, if did you feel one way after you finished the first playthrough, and do you feel differently after playthrough 3, or like where are you with it?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that we're starting with this kind of like general impressions, kind of, gut check, how are we feeling. But yeah, having 3 playthroughs now, my subsequent playthroughs, I definitely feel a lot differently about the DLC. I think my initial playthroughs, I really enjoyed it. I basically took that whole weekend to live and breathe everything Shadow of the Erdtree. And it's hard not to love the first playthrough of a FromSoft game, right? It's easy to overlook some of the things that might bother you, or might not be at the top of your list as far as things you love about a game or a DLC in this regard. Um, but yeah, now that I've had some time with it, I think I'm sitting at, and just to put it on like a 1 to 10 scale, I think I'm sitting at about an 8. This is probably about an 8 out of 10. Base game for me is really high, 9 out of 10. I think Elden Ring has very quickly become my favorite FromSoft game. I'm still a firm believer that Sekiro is their objectively best game, but I've always been more, high fantasy and on the Dark Souls thing. Like, that's kind of my thing, right? I think you and I share a deep love for Dark Souls 3, for example, and throughout the last couple years that we've been living within this world of Elden Ring, it's become my favorite. And it's hard to see the DLC Shadow of the Erdtree as like a true one-to-one comparison to previous FromSoft DLCs because of the scale, right? And because of that, it almost feels like they committed to this grand vision for essentially Elden Ring 2.0, like you were saying. Like, they could have released this as Elden Ring 2, and people, like you said, would be happy. Albeit it might be a little bit short by comparison. But this is nothing like, for example, the old Hunters, right? Or the Ring City. It's nothing. Like, you can't even make that comparison, which is why I think right now we're having a really hard time contextualizing the DLC right now, because we're very experienced with Bloodborne DLC, Dark Souls 3 DLC, and those feel like DLCs, right? They just add a little bit more, and it almost feels like they polish and put like it's like the final brick in the building that is Bloodborne, right? It's the finishing touches, like Orphan of Kos, the cherry on top of the Bloodborne experience, right? Whereas Shadow of the Erdtree, this feels obviously the lore implications and the story. This is maybe the cherry on top for a base game. But as far as the gameplay experience, it's kind of unto itself. Like, it's absolutely Elden Ring, but because of its scale, it's really hard to just, this isn't Gale and Twin Princes and Metyr. It isn't just adding a few more bosses and a few cool new areas. This is adding an entire new game onto the base game. And that's honestly for better or for worse, and we can get into some of those details later as to maybe this was too much, maybe they bit off more than they could chew as far as the scale of this map. But I think overall it was super worthwhile. My first playthrough I absolutely loved. I love a lot of these areas. Bosses, they're cool bosses. I think both you and I have some issues with the boss design choices, but some absolute spectacles. I'm thinking like the Divine Beast fight, Messmer, even Romina. I'm not super hot on the Romina fight, but again, spectacle, the area, the ruins of Rauh. How could you not love just traversing this world? And I think that's where I'm at with the DLC right now. If I'm I know I've kind of been rambling here, but if I'm to kind of encapsulate my thoughts on the DLC, it's the adventure that I love from Elden Ring just repeated into another map. And I again, I'm sitting at about an 8 out of 10, but I think it's more than a worthwhile experience just to like dive into the DLC and enjoy more Elden Ring. Like you said, I think you said you had about 70 hours. I'm not exactly sure how much time my first playthrough was, but to get that much more of a game we already love, that was enough for me. That's kind of where I'm sitting. How are you feeling?
I think I tend to be pretty contrarian and not sharing every mainstream opinion that the people in the community have. I can't imagine wanting to devour a piece of gaming content more than this. Like I can nitpick some of the bosses. I could nitpick one or two of the dungeons maybe or something, but overall, this is like why I play video games. I couldn't imagine having more fun with about anything else. So yeah, I don't know if I could put like a number or a letter or a grade on it, but I loved it. But yeah, I have some nitpicks. I remember this phenomenon, or at least I remember observing this phenomenon some years back when Game of Thrones was on TV. I'm not a big Game of Thrones guy. I'd read the books many years ago. I'd watched some of the show. But I was not like keyed in every week and obsessing and all of that. But I remember noticing how many people I'd see things online. I hear people talk in my own life. It seemed like there became this cycle, this like ritual around Game of Thrones where people would watch an episode. The media would do this too. Like an episode would come out and then everybody would just have a discussion for a week about if that episode personally pleased them or not. And if it didn't personally please them, all the things they wish the showrunners would have done differently. And it's not that Game of Thrones is the only show or the only piece of media to have that kind of reaction among its fans. But I remember feeling like it got so intense and it got so annoying from my vantage point that in my mind it was like, well, look, if you're watching this show every week and after every episode you're going, oh, I wish they would have done these like 5 things differently. Maybe you're watching the wrong show. Maybe if you find yourself after every episode just nitpicking all these things you wish the showrunners would have done differently, maybe Game of Thrones ain't your show. And I'm saying that as somebody who didn't care about the show. I didn't watch the show. I've seen some episodes. Some of it seems good. Some of it seems kind of lousy. Again, I'm pretty indifferent, pretty apathetic toward that show. I'm just using that as an example. And I think that's the funniest thing I've noticed as the community has grown. It's not just the explosion of wikis and YouTube content. It's not just the sales numbers that From has clearly broken into the mainstream now. It's this nitpicking and this scrutinizing. And I understand, like, let's hold FromSoft to a higher bar because we know what they're capable of. But I'm seeing people like just parachuting in. Maybe Elden Ring's like their first game, and then they're learning all this behavior on X and Discord and YouTube, and then they find themselves like saying and regurgitating things. It's like, is that even how you feel though? Like, what are you do? Like, how do you feel? So some of the discourse about Shadow of the Erdtree honestly has kind of weirded me out a bit. Honestly, like, sure, I guarantee we're going to complain about Gaius in this conversation, right? Like, Gaius sucks. We're going to talk about that. But when you look at the rest of gaming, you look at all these other studios, all these other IPs. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, what's better than that? Like, what is higher quality than this? Maybe there's a few in-house Nintendo games that are at a very high level. I think Capcom's pretty impressive with like Resident Evil and some stuff they do. But I mean, again, like by and large, like what even comes close to this? I know what you mean too, Leland. Like, it's so hard to measure this against the base game of Elden Ring. It almost feels like it's more productive to compare this to Dark Souls 1 or something, And if you think that way, it feels like they sold us a sequel for like $40 or whatever. And even that in this scummy gaming landscape of, still, I can't believe how many years have passed and we're still talking about in-game transactions and we're still talking about anti-consumer kind of predatory practices by some of these big companies. And Hidetaka Miyazaki and his team basically turned out a full-fledged sequel. They called it an expansion. They sold it for $40, and it's incredible. So that's where I am. But that doesn't mean that I personally love every aspect of it. I don't. I absolutely don't. But I don't know how much that matters. Like, it's interesting to talk about, and I know we'll talk about some of that stuff, but I'm just not sure. I'm thinking, I guess, more macro, less micro. I'm thinking more like, look what From did yet again. The GOAT delivered again. And that's kind of where I am with it.
Yeah, I think you and I are probably pretty much on the same page in that regard. Nitpicky is the good word for it, right? Like, there are definitely things, and this could just be, because I, for whatever reason, decided to run this game 3 times back to back to back. that the repetitiveness was inherent to, or some of my, not the repetitiveness of the game, but just repeating the same thing 3 times in a row, I'm going to be, my opinions might be swayed by that experience too. It's all how, this is all subjective, right? Like we're just talking about how we feel and our thoughts on the DLC. But if we're going to look at that macro level, yes, this is absolutely insane. This is easily the best DLC that has ever been made by anyone. And I think that it's insane to argue otherwise. So yeah, like you said, the goats deliver once again. Like you can't, like, we have been anticipating this DLC for a year and a half. Obviously, we had a lot of thoughts and we had a lot of wishes. We had a big wish list. You know, we had a lot of theories. I know we've talked at length about what we were hoping to see and what might have been in the final product for this DLC, but boy, did they deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I remember us talking about, a long time ago, like, oh, wouldn't it be really cool to get like another legacy dungeon or two?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
when I go back to like those expectations, it's like, oh my God, like I almost don't understand how in roughly a 2-year period, I mean, I'm sure there's some cut content that made its way in. I'm imagining a lot of these ideas were cooking prior to that early 2022 release of Elden Ring, but it's still like how they produced this much content in that amount of time. And we have so many of these studios where it's like you're waiting like 10 years for the next entry in the franchise. I mean, that's what I always go back to. It's like, oh yeah, Gaia sucks. I wish there were more puzzle bosses. Oh this, oh that. But in the end, it's like, oh my God, in like 2 years, they gave me 75 hours of a new experience to discover.
Right. And even if we're just, again, talking numbers, I think base game, I don't know the exacts, but I think base game's about a dozen or so remembrance bosses, and they gave us about that in the DLC. So just contextually, regardless of like our thoughts on, maybe boss quality or like whether or not we like Gaius or whatever, they gave us basically a whole nother set of remembrance bosses in the DLC. Like that's crazy to me. Again, going back to the comparison to Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne, I think Dark Souls 3 had about 6 or something like that. Bloodborne even fewer, maybe 4 or 5. But like this is like 11 main story bosses is crazy. Ultimately, it's like 43 bosses. I think 20 plus being new. It's absolutely wild the amount of content we got. So being able to experience more Elden Ring is a net positive, a net good thing. And we had 60, 70 hours of it for the price of a DLC.
Right. And I think I always get lost with like the absolute statements by people. I've seen posts online where people are like, the Shadow of the Erdtree level design is trash. And it's like, compared to what, man? Like, compared to what? Like, do you even play video? Okay, there's like a dead end and a chest with a smithing stone in it here, and you didn't like that because you wanted like the sickest boss weapon ever to be in that chest.
Yeah, I'm also, I guess, nitpicky about the exploration to some extent, with there just being like vast areas with little to no reward, and that's fine. I think my first playthrough, just being in these big, beautiful scenes was enough, and then in subsequent playthroughs, it maybe felt a little lesser because of the lack of physical reward, like physical item reward for exploring some of these areas. But
yeah, for sure, there's just a few locations, like exterior locations, that are flashing through my brain of like, oh yeah, I don't really remember there being much to that, or like a big discovery, or even a mini dungeon, in like a cliff wall. I guess like if every single area just had like the sickest weapons and armor ever, it would start to feel pretty predictable. It's like, oh yeah, I just go to this area. Where's like the boss, or where's like the sick armor? Where's this? Where's that? I think when you find those things, it is like, whoa, like this is cool. I didn't expect this. One note on smithing stones too, because I've heard a lot of criticism about, as you're exploring the world, maybe we just get into level design here before bosses, but I've heard a lot of criticism about like, well, I'm finding all these smithing stones. Like, why am I finding a +3 smithing stone? And I feel like it's pretty obvious. Like, they're throwing a lot of new, very cool weaponry at you that you're probably going to want to use. So they're also just making sure you have all the resources you need to fully upgrade those. If you want, you find Milady and you're like, I want this to be my new main weapon. And it's like, oh, I didn't even realize I picked up like 1,000 smithing stones. I can fully max this out and use it right now. So I was a little confused by the criticism there. I understand maybe like in an expansion of such a huge game like Elden Ring, opening a chest in a pretty tough area and getting like a smithing stone +2 is maybe a little underwhelming, but it's like, yeah, but 10 minutes ago you just got that sick staff. Don't you want to use it? Like, this is how you use it. So
I was gonna say, I think my issue there lies in the fact that a lot of and if you engage the DLC much like how you would the base game, and fight enemies and explore areas and engage with it beyond just going from boss A to boss B, you're gonna take down enemies that are already dropping smithing stones. Like I remember before you fighting Rilana, plenty of enemies there that already drop smithing stone 5, smithing stone 6. There's smaller enemies that drop your smithing stones 1s and 2s. We're also going from base game where leading up to this, so many people went and found all the bell bearings, so you can already go and buy all of the buy all the smithing stones. I think that's where comparing this as like a game, like a base game equivalent to a DLC is tricky, right? Like as a DLC, we already have all of this stuff. We already have access. Like I can go buy 1,000,000 smithing stone ones. Why am I hopping across a cliff, opening like a literal chest in like a cool, unique little area, and I'm opening a somber smithing stone too? Like I agree to some extent. Like whereas it could be, a key item. It doesn't have to be, weapons on weapons on weapons. I do think that they gave us plenty of new weapons. Obviously, over 100 new weapons and armors and talismans, all that stuff. But I don't know, a whole new item type, or I don't know. It's hard to, I guess, go from Elden Ring base game, spend hours and hours and hours grinding and finding all these cookbooks and crafting items and upgrade items, and then going into DLC and just finding like early game base game upgrade items. It just feels like there's a little bit of a disconnect there in my brain.
if it's like on a dial, they might have dialed the smithing resources like or overclocked them by like 15%. It's like, you probably had to have like 15% fewer. I also think they would have been criticized had they not had enough material, right? Like damned if they do, damned if they don't. And I think this is part of
the balance.
Yeah, and well, sure. But this is also just part of like what I was getting at, like the sort of state of the community in this 24/7 wiki YouTube guide culture we live in. I think the whole point in Shadow of the Erdtree is you don't have to grind in the base game. You don't have to farm. You don't have to get all the bell bearings. You don't have to panic about all that. And because you have so many content creators pumping out, the 12 things you have to do before you enter the Shadow Realm, and everybody gets anxious and there's FOMO and people are farming stones, and then they get into Shadow of the Erdtree and they're pissed because they're having stones thrown at them. So yeah, that's where I think like From's probably damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Yeah, because I think an enfranchised player's perspective, like you and I, in order to be even engaged with the DLC content, you need to. Most players will have already beaten base game, right? And I think along the way, even if regardless of the how the YouTube community and all the creators have built these guides, things you need to do before DLC, I think you kind of get to that point organically anyways, right? Like I don't think enfranchised players engage with that type of content. And maybe this is like in a completely different perspective or a completely different conversation about what the enfranchised FromSoft perspective is compared to new players, compared to maybe players who struggled through the base game and felt like they needed to use those guys. Like I think those perspectives are valid as well. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is like it is a small detail, right? But I think it is worth pointing out and like acknowledging as not an issue, but definitely a point of criticism. First playthrough, it didn't bother me. Second playthrough, it was like, this is like, there were a couple instances, like I mentioned, where it was literally like a chest. And I think that's maybe in my brain. Like if it's like a little item thing just randomly out in the world and it's a smithing stone, whatever. But there were like unique areas with like a specific vantage point that felt like this is where it was literally staged as, hey, here is your reward for exploring a little bit more. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Leland, I'm imagining the Zelda chest music. I'm imagining like
exactly.
like Ocarina of Time, where you understand like the Kokiri's sword is like sort of in this cave or this like little labyrinth outside of the village, and you're crawling through and you're getting there, and then here's the big chest and there's the dun 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 dun, and instead of the sword it's just a stone, and it's like, oh darn.
It's a green rupee.
Yeah, right. It's like, oh, a green rupee, darn. So yeah, no, I totally get it. I also, and not, not that this is your perspective, but I think if you sink like 40, 50, 60, 100 hours into Shadow of the Erdtree, and the most memorable thing to you is that there were too many smithing stones, I just can't relate.
Yeah,
Like, I
no.
can't. What strikes me so much about Shadow of the Erdtree, somehow the discussions around FromSoft games being too hard, I didn't think they could get any more intense, but they've gotten more intense. While I think maybe the fun factor was lost with some bosses in the expansion, I find even with Shadow of the Erdtree, Elden Ring, just the whole package, it's a very unstressful FromSoft experience. I think compared to like you mentioned Sekiro. Like Sekiro, you have very few tools. There's no co-op. There's no spirit summons. There's no farming and grinding. I mean, in Elden Ring, in Shadow of the Erdtree, you always have an option. Like if you feel stuck, if you're confused, you have spirits, you can always farm, you can resort to co-op. You just always have options at your disposal. And I think it goes back to some comments that like Kitao and Miyazaki made in like their initial kind of promotional tour for the base game, that they focused on removing like the stress and the tension from certain aspects of the game, which is kind of it is like a little bit of a funny dichotomy of Elden Ring, where depending on how you play, it can seem like very unfair and unreasonable. But then on the other hand, it can feel like you're just spoiled with riches and you're spoiled with like almost cheat codes to, to navigate the game. So I think all the stones, it was probably part of that philosophy, was like, let's have too many rather than too few to just keep things cool. Just to make sure nobody has any problem leveling up a new weapon. Let's just err on the side of too many versus not enough.
Like you were saying, like a lot of like a huge draw to the DLC is all the new weapons, right? So why would you, from a design perspective, add a bunch of new weapons but no materials to upgrade them with?
They knew they would have been criticized for that.
They
too.
needed to be there.
Yeah. Well, and there's all new weapon classes, which I think is such a cool thing for them to do. Obviously, in a game like Bloodborne or even the DS3 DLCs, it felt like some of the new weapons, those weapons weren't broken into classes in the same exact kind of way, but it almost feels like a few of those weapons were so interesting and so different than weapons we got in the base game. You could have called them like a new class in a way, but in Elden Ring, they really committed to that, like the giant katanas and the throwables, and like the joy when I got the dry leaf gloves and the dry leaf socks,
so cool.
or whatever they're called. Yeah. I mean,
It's so great.
It's so great. So let's rewind just a little bit to level design, because I have a quick perspective here, and then I want to get yours. But what struck me the most, and it was the thing I was most excited about in Shadow of the Erdtree, was the exploration, was level design, interior spaces, exterior spaces. I think if you're playing a game like Sekiro, it's like, yeah, it kind of is about the boss battles, right? It is about the minute-to-minute combat. And it doesn't mean Elden Ring's not. The minute-to-minute combat in Elden Ring rules. You're playing a great game when it just feels good to swing your sword for the 1000th time, and that's Elden Ring. Like, the most basic sword, like that Lord's Sworn straight sword or whatever that you get, as soon as you come out of the stranded graveyard, that you could play the whole game with that weapon and not get bored, because it just feels so good to swing around. For me, Elden Ring, the direction that they sort of took their Souls formula was like, oh, okay, this is all about the exploration. It's about traversal. It's about caves. It's about mines. It's about castles. It's about finding things. It's about discovery. It's about secrets. I was largely satisfied. I had so much fun exploring the map. The main difference in my mind is that they brought some of their sort of like interior level design staples into the exterior spaces. Like they brought geometry and qualities of like legacy dungeons into those outdoor spaces for the first time, like more tightness, more claustrophobic spaces, more verticality. Whereas the base game, it was much more about that awe factor of like the open fields, right? Like of Limgrave. Even Caelid in a way is like open, kind of swampy fields, a little more elevation change and stuff. But that was the wow factor. And then it feels like in Shadow of the Erdtree, not to say there aren't any open fields, there are, but it feels like there's fewer. and again, that exterior level design, it was much more about like interesting geometry, like weird pathways, stuff looping back on itself, going up, going down, and I really liked that. I really liked that. Does that resonate with you at all, or like what's kind of your overall take on that? I guess like the world level design.
Yeah, no, 100%. You mentioned verticality, and that's immediately where my mind goes to, right? Like the looking at the map, you look at areas, and it obviously map horizontal. You don't get the all the layers, but it was so much fun trying to figure out how to get to certain areas on the map. Like, oh, how do you get down to the Cerulean coast? Oh, well, you have to like go through a tunnel that's like you can kind of see on the map, but like you have to go literally underneath gravesite plane to get down there, and there's no way of like visibly seeing that on the map to do that. You have to just kind of like go up and down and wind your way into these like unique areas, like the ancient ruins of Rauh. It's you kind of just end up there through natural exploration. And I'm thinking like what was it, the cathedral district of Shadowkeep.
Oh,
Like
wasn't that such a cool discovery when you
such a
realize, like, oh
such
my
a
god,
cool
this is
moment.
huge. This is like its own thing.
Yeah, and then the classic Dark Souls lowering of the water and stuff like that, and adding, yeah, like obviously that was part of the legacy dungeon, but going to that, the layers and layers, that those legacy dungeon layers, like you said, are now present in the actual overworld, which I think was really like kudos to FromSoft. And maybe there was some criticisms from, like you mentioned, Caelid. I'm thinking Mountaintop of the Giants, where it's literally just one big flat surface that you go, site of grace to site of grace to site of grace. Like it's not exciting, or it doesn't have these, and it doesn't add to the visual quality either. Like having the verticality and like going to a cliff at the southernmost point of Gravesite Plains and like looking down and seeing like, oh, there are enemies down there. Like that's like that's miles and miles away. What do you mean I can get? How do I get down there? And
Well, and like you said, Leland, the ancient ruins, like when you look up in the sky and you see those and you realize like that's not part of the skybox. Like I can clearly get up there, and it just keeps you wondering throughout that first playthrough, how do I get up there? And then a place like Shadowkeep, where I'm going back to some of the legacy dungeons in the base game, where more or less generally speaking, there's kind of one way in and maybe one way out. And what I loved about Shadowkeep is there's multiple entrances in, and then there's a secret pathway once you're inside that takes you back outside, but into an area you cannot otherwise access. So it's
Right.
that kind of thing where it's like, man, they got really, creative here. And then I think in a place like Shadowkeep, like the interior spaces, the pathways, the enemy placement, I thought was all really well done. I thought, I know this is a detail that would catch your eye and catch your brain too, but the enemy placement I thought overall was very well done in Shadow of the Erdtree.
So
I thought they did such a good job, particularly when they would introduce essentially like a heavy knight, like a strong unit for the first time. It would just be one. And often you would see them from very far away. Like they'd be coming down a pathway or a staircase towards you. And it gives you that moment to like look around and be like, okay, are there any small mobs that might, jump me and mess this up?
Right.
Am I ready for this, or do I need to back up? Do I need to think about going back to the last site of grace? Do I need to, or am I ready for this? So I loved that, and I think that's such a clear critique in past games that it felt like as sweaty as Shadow of the Erdtree can get, particularly in some boss battles. I thought they showed great restraint with enemy placement, and I thought just in general, it feels from the last castle to the first castle feels good. It feels fun. It's challenging, but it never feels overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think Shadowkeep is like a perfect encapsulation of that sentiment, right? Like going from the specimen storehouse, like the talk about enemy placement, just around every corner there's it feels like one big trap and one big puzzle and one big labyrinth. Like it was classic FromSoft design to me, and that it really encapsulated like everything I love about traversing these legacy dungeons in just one part of the greater legacy dungeon. And then how the storehouse, the different layers, the different levels of the storehouse led into other areas of the map, I thought was really well done. And really, as you progress through the story, you come back to the storehouse, you keep coming back, or like you go down, you can take an elevator down to the basement of the storehouse, and it leads you in one direction, or you end up climbing your way to the top and you find another bridge that leads out to another area. It's just so well designed and so like well integrated into the greater map as a whole.
Leland, I love that you call out the specimen storehouse too. Like of all the interior spaces, that was one of the first specific ones you mentioned by name. I loved that location so much. It felt like a little bit of Aldia's Keep, a little bit of the research hall from Old Hunters, but it also felt just kind of unique, kind of little Grand Archives, but it kind of its own thing. And
Grand Archives.
yeah, but back to enemy placement. The majority of the specimen storehouse is full of pretty weak, kind of grunt enemies. But then in numbers, they can overwhelm you. Individually, 1-2 hits, they're dead. But then peppered onto the different levels are these Messmer's Fire Knights, who are very, very tough to deal with.
So cool.
Yeah, they're so cool, but they're very, right, like it inspires anxiety. Did such a good job of that, I thought, in the Shadow Realm, where they created these like heavy knights that just when you see them, you get that pit in your stomach. You're like, oh boy, here we go. But they didn't overdo
it. Turn the corner, you see the little pointy hat.
Yep, but they didn't overdo it. So it's like it kind of conditions you. You're like, okay, I'm going through and taking out these shadow dudes, and occasionally there's some vulgar militia, right? Again, in numbers they can get you, but individually they go down pretty quick. And then it's like, oh, here's a Fire Knight. And I thought that peppering of the Fire Knights throughout, and there's more of them the higher you get up in the storehouse. But that whole dungeon, man, what a awesome space. I cannot wait to redo the whole thing on my next playthrough.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and on my subsequent playthroughs, that was easily, one of the areas that I enjoyed re-exploring the most, because there were a lot of little nooks and crannies that I had missed. I missed Ansbach's questline my first playthrough, so I was like, oh, I have to make sure I do that second playthrough. So I was really like trying to make my way through and be really, again, inhabit. I keep using the word inhabit be part of the specimen storehouse, be part of this huge archival area. You mentioned Grand Archives. It definitely feels similar to that, but even bigger and better. I think that's kind of one of the sentiments about this game is bigger and better. It feels like Dark Souls 3, but bigger and better. But a lot of these legacy dungeons just simply are bigger and better. Like Enir-Ilim, Belurat. I'm sure we'll talk about Belurat too.
Because you mentioned Grand Archives again. I think it's like the bookshelf motif, right? It's like that there's books and there's big towering. Yeah, right.
For sure.
But just by virtue
verticality going up and down.
Yes, and like being able to get on bookshelves. And I think just by virtue of there being bookshelves in the storehouse, that just adds to the level design, because I'm thinking of one little nook in the storehouse where there's, I think, one of the first Fire Knights you encounter, and he's just patrolling around one of the bookshelves. And it's obviously like rectangular, the geometry of the bookshelf is rectangular. So when you get in there, you might think the room is empty. And then before you know it, his patrol path, he's behind you and he's killing you. And I think there's just the bookshelves makes the level design so cool, not to mention, you're jumping on these like fossilized taxidermied corpses and monsters, and oh man, and I think that's what makes Shadowkeep so incredible, is that you mentioned the church district earlier too. The church district just kind of feels like its own dungeon, and then the specimen storehouse kind of feels like its own standalone thing, and these are just all part of Shadowkeep. I think they really achieved something with that dungeon.
It might be my favorite of the legacy dungeons, but within each, again, going back to like how obviously Enir-Ilim and Belurat are inherently connected, but those layers and like the different areas even within the legacy dungeons that feel kind of unto themselves and feel whole themselves, and being able to build upon that foundation. Easily some of the best level design we've seen from.
In Belurat and Enir-Ilim, it felt kind of Zelda-ish to me, how, most players, Belurat's going to be the first dungeon they hit, and it's awesome, right? Like, I remember texting you when I got to that point in the playthrough, and I was like, this is so sick. Like, right, the color palette, the enemies, you're just, the music, you're really starting to, like, soak in the Shadow Realm at that point. And that's actually kind of the final dungeon in the expansion as well, because, obviously it expands later, and you get to the upper reaches, which is all, melting and shadowy at the beginning. And something about that felt very Zelda to me. Like where you start is kind of where you finish too. I thought that was very clever. And Elam in general, maybe felt a little Sekiro-ish, a little Fountainhead Palace-ish or something to me, but I thought that whole area in general just felt really like kind of different. It's like I don't feel like they've ever done a place like this before.
Some might draw comparisons to like an Anne Rolando, or it definitely feels like end game set piece. Like this is effectively the grand staircase leading up to the final boss. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good comparison actually as far as aesthetics go. But yeah, like you said, it's hard to draw. Maybe Erdtree a little bit as far as like the narrow pathing and verticality going up and down, but it's hard to draw comparison to anything else. It's really, I love how it's so contrasted to Belurat, which feels very like fundamental dungeon design, right?
Well, it's much grimier, right? It's a lot grosser, and there's the insects, and there's swampy pits, and then when you're up above, it feels more like divine, or it feels more celestial almost. And there's that, I think something that makes it feel really different is that kind of gold green color palette too. Like I can't remember exactly a location that kind of just visually looked that way, and there's like lots of shades of brown, and there's like the falling sand everywhere, and then the music and the lion motif from the statues to some of the actual enemies you fight. Something about it feels very eerie, very otherworldly, very grand. I just thought it was I think I even maybe texted you when I hit that spot in the expansion, because I think you were already done at that point. And I was just like getting swept away literally to places like that. It's like why we play FromSoft games. Like you want to be taken to a place like that.
I think on the other end of the spectrum, you look at an Ancient Ruins of Rauh, which is hugely expansive, right? To me, that felt like kind of the opposite of all of their other design principles, where for legacy dungeons specifically, where they want to have something like hyper granular, much more contained, like smaller areas to explore and like more labyrinthine. Whereas Ancient Ruins was so big and expansive that I found myself getting lost in like even pathing through the Ancient Ruins on my second and third playthrough. I was like, where am I? Where am I going? And then you'll end up in like a whole other huge area and be like, oh, I've never been here before. I didn't think this place could get any bigger. But so it's interesting to see that contrast too between like Enir-Ilim, which is very like elegant. It is big. It's hugely. I think this same can be said about almost all the legacy dungeons. Visually, they're all like they feel hugely impressive upon you as far as their scale. But the Ruins of Rauh, it was like nothing else I'd experienced from a legacy dungeon, because it's very apparently a legacy dungeon. It's just huge and like open air. I think that's what the real thing is being so open air and seeing more or less the entirety of the whole dungeon while you're traversing it was really, really cool.
That's a great call out. That right, the Ancient Ruins is a legacy dungeon. It's just an exterior one. Yeah, like you said, open air, al fresco, patio dining, except it's a legacy dungeon.
Yeah.
That's such a good call. And you know what? Another funny thing I noticed, because I got the digital like deluxe edition of the expansion, and with that comes a digital art book. And I was going through that, and I think you and I maybe we've talked about this before, but when you go back to like Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, and you look at the concept art, and then you compare and contrast it with the actual 3D renderings and colors and whatnot that appeared in the games, there's a much larger chasm between concept art and final in-game locations and designs in those older games. And I think some of that's technology. Some of that was it was hard to nail the concept art just right because of where the PS3 was or whatever at the time. But what I noticed with Elden Ring, it was much more one-to-one, much more like the concept art was far closer to the in-game rendering. And I'm not saying one approach is better or worse than the others. I think in a lot of cases, like, it's pretty cool to play Dark Souls 2 and then look at the Dark Souls 2 Design Works book and see some of the differences, and it's almost like a different interpretation of the same thing. In Elden Ring, it's all very samey. I noticed that in the digital art book for Shadow of the Erdtree, but the one place that looked most different to me were the ancient ruins. They looked much more, it had that kind of signature from soft, like dripping candle wax, melting concept art kind of texture quality to it. And then in the final game, the ancient ruins are much more like serene and beautiful, and the colors are more saturated. I found myself wondering, maybe because the Shadow Realm is pretty oppressive, like the colors and the darkness, and figuratively and literally, like how dark some spaces are. Wonder if like they just felt that it would be more effective if the ancient ruins, given how high up they are and how unique they are, that if everything did just feel more alive and popped more. And maybe that wasn't what they were thinking right off the bat, because again, the concept art is much more in line with like the gravesite plains or whatever. And I think I like that it's like a breath of fresh air. It's very refreshing when you get up there and you see green grass and things like that. And I'm with you. I got very lost. And then that's when that like good anxiety starts to creep in, where you're like, but I don't want to miss anything. I also like how limited the Elden Ring map is, because you could imagine in Shadow of the Erdtree, they could have done a surface level and a subterranean level of the map like they do for the base game map, where you click your analog stick and you're seeing that bottom layer of the map. That might have given too much away though, right? Because I think sometimes you're not clear where you are, or if there's a layer below you. And I almost think of the way they like artistically designed the in-game map. It feels like an actual map. It doesn't look like some video game interface. It looks like a paper map that may have existed in that time and place. So I like that it's almost like misleading a little bit. It's like if you looked at an old map of North America or something from like the 17 or 1800s, it's going to be a little different than Google Earth today. So I really liked that too. And then, yeah, when you get up into the ancient ruins, you're a little limited. I remember trying to use like map markers and different things to almost define, right, like the perimeter. And it's like, I think I've gone to the edge over here, and you're kind of limited with the map tools. You really do just have to get out there and run around, ride around. That was a really fun part of the playthrough for me though too.
I think it might be good to, by comparison, we're talking about a lot of these, things we love about the level design. I will say there are a couple things that I disliked, or areas rather that I disliked, and not so much for like their aesthetic value, but rather for the gameplay value that they added. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking like Jagged Peaks, I'm thinking Hinterlands, yes, lore-wise, and maybe as Jagged Peaks set piece, like this is Bale's little realm. Hinterlands, yes, there are lore implications with Marika, very important, cool. They were just so empty. Like there were some parts of the map that, while we were just talking about how they took these legacy dungeon-esque features and added them and like added a lot of detail to certain areas of the map, it did feel kind of inconsistent as a whole throughout the map with that level of detail, right? Hinterlands in particular I found really struggling to find any sort of value on my second playthrough. Literally go to the Hinterlands. It's a pretty area. It's also unique, and yeah, lore means a lot with the Shaman village and everything. But you literally you go to the Hinterlands, which is a hidden area, and you fight 2 tree sentinels and what was it called? The Falling Star Beast. And then there's nothing else there. That's it. Same thing with the Jagged Peak. You fight 2 reskins of like base dragons. You fight a reskin of Fortisax, and then you fight Bale, who I think you and I are both kind of like on. And it's this huge part of the map, the huge Jagged Peak that you have to like traverse, and it's kind of a pain in the ass to traverse too. And then the Abyssal Woods, same thing. Like, yeah, huge, cool, eerie area with like this spooky vibes. You can't summon Torrent there, and like that was really cool first playthrough. And you got to go to the manor to fight old, what's his face, the Lord of Frenzy Flame. Midra. But there's literally nothing else there. So there are these huge, like, and I get that to some extent that's part of the point. Like, there are areas in our world, like, I don't know, Iowa, where there's just nothing there, and that's fine.
Leland, how dare you compare Iowa to the Abyssal Woods? What are you thinking?
All love to our Iowa listeners. But so like there is some like validity to that, right? Like Gravesite Plain is huge, expansive, and like that's kind of the point, right? It allows you to like look and see everything else, and that feeling of awe really sets in. but places like the Abyssal Woods had an impact on first playthrough for a little bit of time, and then you're just walking for like 10 minutes across it, and you do literally nothing else. Same thing with the Hinterlands. You fight 3 base game bosses. There's nothing else. Jagged Peak, a bunch of base game reskins, and a mid dragon fight. Like, it was really hard third playthrough. I'll tell you that. Third playthrough, those areas were completely pointless beyond going to fight the bosses, which was unfortunate. Like, they're aesthetically cool. While there were plenty of areas that had a lot of value and a lot of, like, FromSoft level design at its finest, I think maybe the scale of this DLC, they kind of, I mentioned earlier, maybe they like bit off more than they could chew, because some of these areas there's just nothing to do. And if you do the Count Ymir quest line, you've got all those big finger ruin areas, which look awesome, but it's just for the quest line. There's no bosses there. There are, I guess there's a bunch of unique little enemies that are extremely annoying, but yeah, there are no, like, again, items. Not that you need to be rewarded necessarily for exploration at all times at any given time, but there were 0 items of interest in these areas that took, 10, 15 minutes to go from to fully explore. Like the Abyssal Woods, that's like half hour right there potentially, and you get maybe 1 shadow tree blessing thing from that. Like, I don't know.
No, I think those are all really good areas to chat about. Like Hinterlands and the Abyssal Woods, most of the value comes from that first playthrough. Like when you're completely blind, it's a process of discovery. And yeah, there's areas in other From games where it's like, man, on the second playthrough, you're probably running through this area. Like, there's not a lot going on here. There's not a lot of value for sure. With like the Hinterlands, like, it is literally the point. The whole point is that it's abandoned. And I think it'd be interesting to like talk a little bit more about that and why it's abandoned. But, the Abyssal Woods, to me, I know what you mean. And I've even found that as I've been doing like some cleanup on my playthrough, and I've gone back there a time or two. I really like the Abyssal Woods because this is what I think. I think From is going to do something in a future game, and we're going to look back at the Abyssal Woods and be like, oh, that was the precursor. Like, if it hadn't been for the Abyssal Woods, we wouldn't have gotten here. I loved coming into the Abyssal Woods. It says Torrent's too scared, so that gets your attention right away. That's really engaging. And then you start getting these messages, like I'm almost thinking like a Resident Evil, like a survival horror game where there's like notes around a creepy mansion or something. You start getting these messages where it's like, turn back while you're still able to, or, don't let it see you. And, oh, I was so scared. I was like, it's a full on like Miyazaki just going horror. And I didn't know how to interpret the messages I was getting. So I literally thought on my first playthrough, all the sheep, like I couldn't let even a sheep see me. Yeah.
I thought that.
I was sneaking
like
through,
the
not
frenzy flame eye.
Yes. And I think that's what's cool is you don't really know just how serious or not serious the threat is. And yeah, I think on a first playthrough, that area is pretty incredible. I would love to see more of that kind of thing. Like, again, like kind of a refined take on the Abyssal Woods in a future game. Like, yeah, it feels a little survival horror, you got limited visibility. You can't traverse very quickly. I agree. Like, when you go back to it, you're like, maybe this area could have been like 25% smaller or something.
Yeah, in my mind, I think in this, again, Sekiro, there are a lot of really, really great things about the level design in Sekiro, but I think a good comparison for me in my mind of what the Abyssal Woods could have been is like a Mibu Village, right? Where you have the whole kind of horror, spooky aesthetic, and something is wrong here. Like there's something up here, and I need to figure out what that is. Mibu Village, there's so much exploration to be had, and it's a really small part of Sekiro, right? Mibu Village is tiny, but you can jump into buildings. There's like there are multiple NPCs. There are multiple quest lines. There's if you can go into the river and get rewarded that way. There are plenty of enemies, unique enemies to fight there. So that's it, beyond just being the set piece of like, hey, here's the spooky horror little vibe that is present in the Abyssal Woods. We already have, like you're saying, like maybe Abyssal Woods is setting up for like what we see in From's next game. Maybe they really lean into that aesthetic and the kind of like expansive looming nature of that horror aesthetic. I just think we've seen it done with Mibu Village, similar vibes, but there's actually stuff to do in that setting too. It's not just a set piece. There's actually, you can play a game. I think that's like gameplay wise, Abyssal Woods, Hinterland, all the like weird finger ruin things. You hop on torrent, or in Abyssal Woods case, you can't even hop on torrent in the Abyssal Woods, which is, yeah, like you said, initially cool. It's like, oh, that adds to that spookiness. But then you're just walking. We just walk through all of these areas. Mibu Village, you fight unique enemies, you talk to unique people, and I think, I keep saying maybe they bit off more than they could chew on the sense of scale with the map, because there are just so many areas where it's just like, if only there was someone I could talk to here, or interact with, or fight even. Like, what are we going to fight? Sheep and rats in the Abyssal Woods? What are we going to fight? The recycled, the sorcerer enemies from Midra's manse,
whose clothing, for some strange reason, you can't actually get in the expansion, which really bothers me, because that would be such a cool set to have. But I think Mibu is a great comparison. And I think maybe like Mibu, where, you go bonk our jazz flutist friend a couple times, and Mibu, well, I'm thinking about the forest prior to Mibu, right? And then that whole...
Oh, yeah, true. That's
right.
That's an even better comparison.
Yeah, because then...
It's literal forest.
Exactly. And then the mist lifts, and the area changes. It looks different, exactly. and then you don't have that same challenge, like in the future, if you're revisiting that area, of navigating all the fog and things like that. So maybe they could have done something like that in the Abyssal Woods, where there's a certain enemy or there's something you have to do, and then like you change the Abyssal Woods a little bit, and maybe you can ride torrent then. That would have been like a nice quality of life thing. And I think for me, Leland, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I think the Abyssal Woods, so again, love the concept, would love to see them play around with this in a future game. I think where it struggles, though, is like Midra's Manse is the payoff. And we saw Midra's Manse in the trailer pretty prominently. And we saw Midra in the trailer pretty prominently. So it was pretty late in my playthrough that I got to the Manse. So I had a lot of I kept wondering, when are we going to see that guy? When I got there and when I first walked into the Manse, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be my favorite dungeon in the game. This is going to be so cool. And it felt like as soon as it started getting good, it was over. And then the boss battle, I've heard people say things like Midra is a masterclass in boss design. And I just don't relate. I don't get it. I feel like Midra is just a poised zombie. He just walks at you and either shoots at you with his eyes or slashes at you with his sword. He's could have been so cool, could have been so much more. The dungeon could have been so much more. And then even when the battle ends, you're just standing there in the room and it's like, okay, I guess I'll show myself out. I'll turn around and literally walk out the way I came in. Kind of to your point, maybe bit off a little more than they could chew. It feels like that area could have just had a little more time in the oven, a little more TLC. Because I think if Midra's Manse reached its full potential, you might look back at the Abyssal Woods and kind of just be like, okay, overall, I get it. Because I understand where this led. But I was very let down by that boss, by that dungeon. I wanted to love Midra. I really tried. I wanted to love the dungeon. I mean, there's a lot of cool ingredients there, but it just feels like ultimately it didn't really go anywhere. At least for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's even on its scale, it's much smaller than all the other legacy dungeons, which I think is fine. Not all legacy dungeons need to be giant and sprawling. But even just sitting here talking to you in my mind, I can run through Midra's Manse. I know, I'm visualizing every single room in Midra's Manse and how to get to point A to point B from the entrance to the boss. I know how to do it. And I think that's so antithetical to From's level design. Typically, you need to sit and ruminate and consider all the different areas. I'm thinking about Belurat now, and I'm sure there are still areas that are nooks and crannies of that legacy dungeon that I haven't touched yet. I remember, I think second playthrough, I finally went down into the kind of swampy, the poison swamp area, and that opens up and it's huge. I didn't realize how big that was on my first playthrough. There are all these nooks and crannies that allow these dungeons to be revisitable and interesting to reconnect with, and being like, oh, maybe there are a couple things that I missed my first 5 or 6 times through. Whereas Midra's Manse, you do it once, you don't really need to ever go back there. I think to your point, it's smaller, but it's not intricate. It's very linear in design. And then yeah, Midra, you beat him, and you're just in Midra's room. It's like, well, yeah, I guess yeah, I'm done here. And then even if you go back, I initially thought, because there's the NPC when you first enter Midra's Manse, who's like, oh, whatever you do, don't, go against the Lord's wishes or whatever. And you come back to him, you're like, okay, that's fine, whatever. Maybe, after you beat Midra, you come back to him, and he still says the same thing.
Yeah, he's still like, boo, I'm still a ghost.
I'm still a ghost. Don't upset the Lord's wishes. And it's like, well, I just went and killed your Lord. Isn't, I thought, I was like, oh, maybe I have to go interact with that guy, and he'll open the bookcase behind him, and there'll be like another layer to this. It's like, no, he just same line of dialogue, which, yeah, I don't know, it definitely just feels unfinished. I think for me that was like the where it clicked in my brain, where I came back to that same NPC and his dialogue hadn't changed, where I was like, yeah, this was like a placeholder. You know what I mean? Like they had something else planned here, and they just didn't have the time to, and this is it. This is what we get.
I'm definitely with you. What I do want to do, though, is defend the Hinterlands, though. To me, this is sort of a silly comparison, but it's the best one I can make. The Hinterlands is the equivalent of getting 120 stars in Super Mario 64, the cannon opening, and you getting to shoot yourself on top of the castle and meeting Yoshi and getting 100 lives. It's there. It's sort of this borderline Easter egg secret. It's not essential to your completion of the expansion, but boy, it adds a lot if you go there. And it is the one area that is supposed to be quiet. It's supposed to be empty. It's supposed to be serene. It's not about finding chests and fighting, a bunch of enemies. I think the tree sentinels are likely there because of the Marika connection, and they're protectors of the Erdtree. Like, maybe they traveled and discovered that area and wanted to stand guard by it. But yeah, I mean, I was almost in tears when I found it in the first playthrough, and like the music kicked in. And, you explore the village and you find Marika's braid, but nothing else. And that's like the point. Like, you keep expecting to find something, and then it's just the little Erdtree. I think this is like a good time just to talk for a second about the whole deal of Shadow of the Erdtree and Marika. So, like, I mean, I talked to, folks in my Discord server and stuff, but outside of that, and like us talking now, I mean, I've not read much or heard much or talked to many people about this, so I'm sure everybody has like a slightly different take. And again, I've only played through it once, but like my current read on like the real story of Elden Ring is that the Shaman, so the Hinterlands is the home of the Shaman village. So the Shaman, I think, are like the original Newman, and they originate from that village, Marika's village, and they were put into pots by the Hornsent. And I think the Hornsent are the original omens. And they did this, they put the shaman into these pots as part of like a crucible experiment, like an attempt to achieve, I guess, what the game calls divinity. And I believe this is why Marika shuns the crucible. It's sort of like the oppressed becomes the oppressor. I'm even open to the possibility that like maybe Marika herself was put into a pot to like meld, but actually did ascend to godhood. I mean, either way, she ascends to godhood. And then that pisses off the Hornsent. And I think the Hornsent cursed her and her offspring. And maybe with the seedbed curse, I don't know. That's probably a stretch. But I think this is where Messmer comes in. Like, she used him to purge her oppressors. Like, she kind of used her own trauma to justify her own genocide. And I think that's, like, hence the power of that empty, forgotten shaman village. Like, nobody's there. There's no shaman. There's no Hornsent. There's no Marika. They're all gone. And it's just the music and the flowers and the quiet space. Like, it's all there for you to pause and think about all of these things and all of these people and all of these conflicts, and, kind of make your own judgments. And I think she was cursed, like Marika was cursed, like either directly or inadvertently by being forced into a pot herself. Like the omen, because the omen aren't just these hideous monsters. I think they're reminders of the Hornsent and what they did to her people, which is why they were purged from the lands between, except a select few, like her children. They were tossed into sewers to be forgotten. I think it's all kind of like this sick cosmic joke where like nobody's spared, like everybody suffered here. And I think it all calls into question too, what exactly is the original sin in the universe of the lands between? Like, who's ultimately to blame? Who's responsible? It's a really hard question to answer because there's a lot of hate, there's a lot of death, there's a lot of abandonment, and like two wrongs don't make a right. But I think the expansion, it sheds so much light on Marika. She was wronged and traumatized. She sought revenge and she got it, but it made things even worse. And now she can't escape her predicament. She's a prisoner. Maybe Radahn was a means of escape, but then he too becomes a pawn of the greater will. And I think there's something, despite her sins, there's something about the image of her crumbling body crucified in the Erdtree that's even more sad now. So that's kind of my read on the story of Elden Ring and the story of Marika and like what the Shadow Realm kind of illuminated for us. And it really like almost goes back and like retcons all the pot stuff, like the cute little pot boys. It's like not so cute anymore. And it's
not so cute.
It's so messed up. And there's that one NPC, I'm sure you know the one I'm talking about. It's in the name's escaping me, but it's that one cliffside village. And when you talk to the ghost, he's like telling somebody, he's like, get in the pot. And it's just like, oh my God.
Yeah. And I think that's the one in the it's in one of the pot villages, or Bonnie Village, I think is what it's called. Inside, I think it's got like a tooth whip is like the weapon that you find there. Even it's just so twisted.
I was so surprised by how many questions, I think a lot like old hunters did with Bloodborne. I was kind of surprised by how many questions it feels like Shadow of the Erdtree actually answers for us.
Yeah, I'm not the biggest lore buff regarding Elden Ring, but it is interesting to see. It felt like, even just like from the NPC questline perspective, it was all very like linear, and every time you talk to Ansbach or what's her name, Freya or Lida, they told you pretty much point blank exactly like who they were, who they served, what was going on with Miquella. Like all of the narrative of the DLC was much more black and white when compared to almost all other FromSoft games, all of the Souls-likes, but particularly the base game, where we were left with a lot of questions about Godwyn, Marika, Radahn, and Miquella, obviously being kind of the whole focal point of the DLC here. And obviously we got answers about Saint Trina, and I don't know, it was cool to experience Elden Ring, but with a much more just like hey, I'm going to tell you exactly kind of what you need to know right now regarding Radahn, like what's going on with Miquella using Mohg's body to revive Radahn, and like all this stuff that Ansbach's kind of like the main man as far as like unveiling what's happening during the DLC. And I found that approach really refreshing, because it kept me engaged with the storyline while also not really, like, as a DLC, I didn't really have to like overthink things lore-wise, or have to feel like I needed to really dig deep into the flavor text of all the items, which are still, from what I understand, really revealing, and there's a lot to be like gained from reading all the flavor text, which I'm appreciative of. But I'm glad that we had Ansbach by our side to kind of like guide us mentally through the DLC, because sometimes it's like playing through FromSoft game is it's all about the adventure and exploration, but the pieces just don't add up in your mind as far as the storyline. So maybe that was their approach here, is like, hey, this is a DLC. Some players haven't engaged with the narrative of Elden Ring for potentially 2 years at this point, so let's kind of like maybe spoon feed it to them a little bit more, so they can more easily jump back and be like, oh yeah, okay, so Freya is Radahn's knight. Okay, this makes sense. Like, I remember that character now. And then you can kind of use those parallels as one-to-ones with Ansbach's guidance. So, yeah, I don't know. I really appreciate how the story was kind of told through the DLC.
I just wanted to pull this up real quick because I just thought it was really interesting, like going back to Marika and that minor Erdtree and the spell you get. I just wanted to go back to that flavor text. Let's see, I got it right here. Secret incantation of Queen Marika. Only the kindness of gold, without order, creates a small illusory Erdtree that continuously restores the HP of nearby allies. Marika bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well there was no one to heal. I don't know, really interesting. Like, it's like, yeah, I mean, America was still, a bastard in her own way, and she did bad things, but she becomes, more sympathetic. And I think finding her home and realizing what happened to her people, you at least better understand her her path. And yeah, I just keep wondering if like Radahn was more a means of escape for her. Why Radahn, right? Like, why are Radahn and Marika one side of the same coin? And I keep wondering, maybe Radahn was like her escape. That was like her way out of this trap she was in. And then even that doesn't work because he becomes a puppet and she becomes, just trapped by the will. And I thought it was really interesting too. We're thinking about like some of the NPCs and some of the implications. I would definitely like to talk about Metyr a little bit. One of my favorite bosses.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, one of my very favorite, not just from Shadow of the Erdtree, but I think in the whole game. I think it's so interesting that we learn, kind of like you were saying, where I do find it refreshing as well, where some things are just pretty spelled out. Because yeah, the base game's a bit obtuse when it comes to some characters and some backstories, and we learned that Metyr stopped receiving like any communication from the will. It reminded me a little bit of Ebrietas, like just sort of abandoned. Ymir is a pretty unreliable narrator, but they also tried to commune with the will, with the staff they create, and that's to no success. So I think it kind of goes back to everything Vare was telling us in the base game, like this is all a sham. It's not even so much that like the fingers have an agenda or they're evil, but I think like the way I put it in my Discord server was it's almost like a satellite dish with no satellite up in space. Like there's nothing for the dish to receive. It's just, yeah, something about like actually finding, like getting transported to this ground zero where the fingers first hit the lands between, and Metyr is just there kind of waiting, alone and abandoned. And then that battle, what a spectacle that battle is. But I just thought, from like what we learn in the Hinterlands, which I think is powerful and I think justifies that kind of being, like I said, top of the castle in Mario 64, that kind of thing, to what we learn with Metyr. I don't know. I was just so taken by all of this, and I did not expect them to give us these kinds of answers to fill in these kind of gaps in like the story of the lands between. So I was really pleasantly surprised by all that.
Yeah, you mentioned Metyr as being one of your favorite bosses. Maybe this is a good segue into boss design? Question mark.
Yeah, I also want to make one really quick note on, because I think you mentioned Ansbach.
Yeah.
I really liked him. Like,
Mhm.
he was one of my favorite NPCs throughout the playthrough. I guess this segues well into bosses. Did you get like chills though when I'm assuming you didn't have this spoiled for you. I hope you didn't. But when he first, because I think he's the first one to mention this to you in Shadow Keep. I think it's actually in the specimen storehouse. But he mentions that like Mohg's body has disappeared.
Yeah.
Maybe like
yeah.
Miquella or somebody, like I don't know how, I can't remember the exact dialogue, but he essentially communicates to you that someone has stolen Mohg's corpse and he thinks it's for a nefarious purpose. And like when I first heard that, I was like, whoa, Mohg's coming back into this somehow.
Yeah, no, that was such a cool moment. And I think literally every interaction with Ansbach is like super illuminating. It's hard not to like always wish for more with these games, but I wish a few of them had been built out a little bit more. Like Lida's intentions are very, like I was just saying how the story being laid out very plainly was refreshing, and kind of you shared that same sentiment, but Lida's like motives are just so cut and dry that it's hard to find her compelling. I think the Hornsent's really interesting. I think Egon's cool. Moore is a really unique character, but I wish that there was a bit more substance to, like, we've got all these great NPCs, right? But it almost feels like there's like Lida and Ansbach, and then everything else is just kind of like, and I guess Egon, he's kind of off, he's doing his own thing, but I just wish the others were a bit more, their quest lines, I guess, are a bit more robust. Like their stories are all compelling enough, I suppose, but yeah, I wish there's a bit more substance to these NPC quest lines.
Yeah, like I wanted a little more with like Freya, and yeah, there were a few characters where it's like I would have liked a little more here. I think like Talier is another one that's pretty fleshed out. Like I think Ansbach, Talier, but I know what you mean, because I think all the new NPCs they threw our way were intriguing. So you just naturally want more. And yeah, it's so hard to say. It's like, is this from being obtuse, or would it have just been better if we got a little more from this NPC? Like, I don't know. I do know Lita kind of creeped me out when I got to the Shadow Plateau, or the Altus, Shadow Altus, and I talked to her, and she's kind of like, so do you think I should just like start killing members of the party, or like, what do you think about that?
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa. And I ended up siding with Hornsent, and like what I was just saying, like sort of my own interpretation of the Marika stuff. Like, I don't know that Hornsent, who we meet in the game, I don't know that he and his people are super sympathetic themselves. But yeah, when I walked up to Lita, it's kind of like, hey, Lita, how you doing? It's a nice view up here, huh? And she's like, yes, should I start killing everybody? I actually didn't commit to her dialogue at that point whatsoever. I just walked away from her and then fully committed to the Hornsent route in the quest. I thought that was a pretty great moment. I know what you mean, like Lita's a little more cut and dry than like Hornsent. Like Hornsent's a little more complex, I think. But that did remind me a little bit of, some trolley characters, like some violent trolley characters we've had in past Souls games. Okay, are you like homicidal, or what's going on here?
Just to put a cap, I guess, on the Lita thing, is her personality is great, right? Like having that character archetype of like just like the headstrong, like very firm in their beliefs. It was kind of like, it did make you feel like you had to make a decision there, right? Because she was like, oh, maybe I'll go, I'm either gonna take out Hornsent or Ansbach, I think she mentions, even Tialier as well. So it's like, oh, I don't want to commit and have her kill off one of my other NPC quests here. So it did add a layer of like intrigue right off the bat, having her be like, I don't trust any of these. And it makes you kind of be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't trust any of these other people either. Or maybe I shouldn't trust you, like you were saying. Like their personalities were dynamic. I just wish that, yeah, Freya in particular, I think is the one that comes to mind, where she was so cool. Her armor was awesome. But it's literally just like, you meet her in Gravesite Plain, you see her struggling to do research, and like that's kind of it.
Yeah, so. I thought there was going to be more in the storehouse. When I saw her in the storehouse, I was like, ooh, and there is that interaction with Ansbach and her to like advance her quest a little bit. But yeah, I kind of thought when I found her there, I was like, oh, this is getting interesting. And then you're right. Like I guess personally, I didn't get exactly what I wanted there. Yeah, I'm going to have to force myself, though, to do the Lita line on this second playthrough. I do. I missed some stuff with Talier, too. With St. Trina, it's so funny. I, like, imbibed the nectar twice, but I ended up doing a little online digging after I finished, after Talier disappeared. And it was like, I had actually imbibed the nectar and killed myself enough times that had I just walked over and talked to Talier again, I think I understand that I would have advanced the quest line. So I was almost there, but it's pretty obtuse. It's pretty obtuse.
Yeah, it's super obtuse. I remember in like, because I did it all 3 playthroughs, and it's like, oh, well, guess I'm going to throw on something on YouTube while I kill myself like 8 times in a row with St. Trina or whatever. But yeah, super obtuse, but that's why we love Ram.
Well, let's start with like your top 3 bosses. If you just had to pick your faves, what are your top 3?
Oh man, that's
try not to
question.
overthink it. Try to go with your gut.
Go with my gut, and in my show notes, I actually ranked them all intentionally, because I was like, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, just like, gut check. How do we feel? I agree with you. I think Metyr is one of my favorites, if not my favorite. So that's definitely top 3. I think Messmer, regardless, we will get into Messmer and like maybe some of the issues with Messmer, but I think aesthetically top 3, maybe not a top 3 fight, but definitely top 3 from like he's like, he's the cover of the DLC, right? He's the first one we really get to see in the trailer. And I think he lived up to his name and his vibe and the cutscene and stuff. So he's a top 3 for sure. And then maybe, honestly, Divine Beast, Dancing Lion. It kind of goes with my track record of first bosses being my favorites. I love Gundyr in Dark Souls 3, Godric in the base game of Elden Ring. Everyone loves Gascoigne. And I think Divine Beast was kind of like the perfect start to the DLC. So Divine Beast, Dancing Lion, Messmer, and then Metyr are going to be my top 3.
Yeah, we have lots of overlap. I would go Metyr, Shadow Avatar. Those are definitely my top 3.
Shadow Avatar is definitely probably in that fourth slot for me too. So
Yeah, it made me think of like Amygdala or something. Like I always love when From does like a monster boss, and I thought it was just a really, I mean, the sunflower design was so cool. I just thought the fight was really exciting, and an annoyance I had, and I know I'm not alone in this, is that I thought, and this isn't about difficulty per se. It's just right. It's almost more about the boss design, which I think is a term you used earlier. Just too many charging attacks for me. Like just a little too much charging in Shadow of the Erdtree with the bosses. I thought Shadow Avatar was an example of charging done well, where in the second and third phases, there's those long slide attacks, but they're readable. They're not spammed. Depending on the RNG you get, you might not see them a whole lot. So I thought that was also an example of charging done well. Again, cool design, amazing music. And it's kind of the same deal with the other ones I mentioned, like Metyr. Amazing music, amazing design. Just a spectacle. I know we've talked about that before too, like a spectacle of a boss fight. That is a spectacle of a boss fight. I thought it even far exceeded Estelle for me. And just like it's
100%.
It's just a little more fun for me than Estelle. Estelle, has those attacks really trying to keep you at a distance. And I think Metyr is cool because you can just kind of get up close and fight Metyr. And yeah, I think a little more of a fun factor there. And then Dancing Lion is just, I thought it was just awesome. It is a challenge. The music is unbelievable. I think it's so Shoei Miyazawa, who I thought was really like one of the stars of this, post-Yuka Kitamura music world for FromSoft. Miyazawa did a lot of the best tracks in Shadow of the Erdtree, and that Dancing Lion music is like top tier. And again, a spectacle of a fight. It's horrifying because you can tell there's like human legs underneath it, and I even clipped through. I think like on a death, my death screen clipped through the boss model a little bit, and you can see there's basically like two dudes under the mask and the rug or cape or whatever.
Yeah, did you see the Bonfire VN video where they remove the costume? Have you seen that?
No, I haven't. I bet it looks crazy.
I'll have to send that to you, because not only do they remove the all the robes and stuff off the model and reveal that it's literally just two dudes. It's two dudes in a lion costume, which is hilarious. But they also go in and like show off the fight itself without the costume on. It's literally these two humans, just two bald human guys, twisting and turning and moving around in the air like the Divine Beast does, and it's the funniest thing I've ever seen. But yeah, I love that it's literally just two dudes in a lion costume, the boss.
Yeah, and I think it's like some of those bosses, it's like a giant finger monster, a giant sunflower monster. For me, my kind of takeaway with the bosses is, for my personal taste, too many charging attacks and too many sweaty knights. Like, I know, yeah, just too much. Like, I know Rauh has become a real fan favorite, and that's where I just deviate. Like, I was very underwhelmed by Rauh. It felt like Rauh should have had a cutscene. Doesn't have a cutscene, and then
I actually made a note. Speaking of cutscenes, while you mention cutscenes, I feel like every Remembrance boss should have had a cutscene, because it really took away. Like, obviously Messmer had one. But going into like the Shadow Tree Avatar, that should have had a cutscene. In my mind, Putrescent Knight should have had one. Metyr also, I feel like Metyr, as much as we love Metyr already, she's awesome. But like, imagine that with like a cutscene of her like coming down or something.
See, that one I kind of like, just walking up, and you can't quite tell. Yeah, like, is that an enemy? Is that a boss? And then it just kind of activates when the fight starts. I kind of like that one, but I know what you mean. Yeah, it feels like in general they were lacking.
Yeah, there are certain ones, like Placidusax, same thing. There are certain bosses where walking to the arena, it's cool. But like Romina, I think for me, Romina is like the biggest, probably not my least favorite boss, but like the boss that had the most potential. Like you said, she's one of like the 3 mandatory bosses, and not only is she a really easy fight, but she also has no cutscene. So on all 3 of my playthroughs, I went into Romina, killed her, and then moved on, and like that's it. And I think her design looks really cool. She's got this like all these like weird pink purple butterfly like attacks that like deal the rot, scarlet rot. She's like a rot boss that I think would be really cool if it was like, she is like a lore significant boss that I don't know anything about, that just kind of feels like a bump in the road. Like, she should have had a cutscene. She should have been a bit more, I don't know, like the setting is awesome. Like, you can see Enir-Ilim off in the distance. You know you have to beat her to burn.
Well,
and it's just
Leland, to your point, like Romina is responsible for the Scarlet Rot, like as we understand it in the Lands Between, and she was a victim of Messmer. Like, that's what we learned from her remembrance flavor text, right? Like that, she's so important. Build probably has a lot to do with it. I found her a bit awkward. Like, she killed me quite a few times, but I like the fight. It definitely feels like an evolution of like the Quelaag or the Najka. It's like the next, more aggressive, more advanced step of that kind of boss. Yeah, and like her pull blade is one of my favorite weapons in the entire expansion. Like that and Milady are like my two, because I played through with a Dex Arcane character. So Milady and the pull blade of the Bud, I believe it's called, those are my two favorite weapons. So yeah, I mean, Romina is really important. And I think that is like clear cut. That's one of those bosses that would have benefited a lot from some kind of cutscene, just somehow like emphasizing the importance of like this church was ravaged by Messmer's crusade. Romina was a victim. She, like, I think the flavor text is really strange. I'd be interested to get like a good translation of like the Japanese text from somebody who's capable of doing that. But I think it says something like the element, like she wove the element that became the Scarlet Rot or something like that. So it's a little unclear, but yeah, totally benefited from a cutscene. And I think R'hllana, we maybe talked about this, but it feels to me like R'hllana is just basically in Loretta's armor, has Pontiff's swords, has no cutscene, and is just super sweaty. And like, the swords are no doubt cool, right? Like, if you wield the swords and use them, like, they're fun to use. It's really cool.
Yeah, for my second playthrough, I used her swords, and it was like the most fun I've ever had, because it's got not one but two weapon arts, kind of like, again, pointing back to Sullivan. When you get his Lord of Cinder, or his soul that you can transmute, you get the two swords. So it's definitely a callback to Sullivan. But yeah, I agree. The sweaty knight, like humanoid fights in this game, and like Messmer also is like the big issues with Messmer with that too. But yeah, while we're talking about R'hllana, I think it's interesting because I also kind of share your thoughts, where it's just super hyper aggressive, not a lot of windows to respond, get in attacks of your own. It's a lot of just rolling around, evading, jumping when you need to jump, and that type of hyper aggro approach wasn't really fun for just one-on-one. However, I did a co-op run with some friends, and this fight was super fun 3v1 because of her level of aggression. You can't just pull aggro and move around because of the amount of, like, her hitboxes are super wide. She does a bunch of big AoEs. She shoots magic. So this is, and because of for whatever reason, I don't know, obviously you said I think you did a solely no summons playthrough, right?
Yeah, I didn't do any online summoning. I popped spirits. I popped spirits for a few fights I just straight up hated, like Gaius.
Yeah, Gaius without us.
Yeah, Gaius is trash. So that's my quick detour hot take on Gaius. I think it's the worst boss to be in a Frem game, like maybe ever, and at least in 10 years. Like, it's bad.
Really?
Like, it's terrible. It's so bad. I mean, I cannot believe it even made it into the game as is.
Wow. It's literally just, the fight itself is literally just Draconic Tree Sentinel 2.0, and it's like, it's not necessarily like difficult or interesting. He just like hits really hard, and that's it. You know what I mean? Which is a shame, because he like looks kind of cool. Like, he's got this big boar, and like, I don't know, but yeah, the fight itself is super uninspired and just straight up just a worse Draconic Tree Sentinel.
Yeah, like, I would rather fight a Tree Sentinel. I would rather fight Loretta. It's not fun. Yeah, it's just a big charging slug coming at you over and over, and it's very annoying, and the AoE stuff in Phase 2 is annoying. I just thought Gaius was absolutely terrible. But yeah, like, Rolana, I it just felt like it wasn't anything new. Like Dancing Lion is very new. And it felt like Rolana doesn't have much of a distinct personality either, because Rolana just kind of does all the things. Like Rolana has all the magic. Rolana does all the AoE. Rolana it was like too much. Like Rolana does not have, because I think all the really great knights throughout FromSoft's games, they have like a pretty distinct personality. Like Artorias has a really distinct personality. Gundyr has a distinct personality. Fume Knight. I was very, very underwhelmed by Rolana, but I was also surprised to see that's like not the popular opinion. It sounds like Rolana's like everybody's favorite.
Yeah, I guess I don't really, I haven't engaged with the conversations surrounding the bosses too much yet. But yeah, I guess her being one of like the early bosses, it makes sense for people to maybe latch onto her. But yeah, like you said, she's literally just a carrion knight. Like that's her personality. She's just another carrion knight. And I wish, yeah, they might have, and maybe a cutscene. Maybe it's just as simple as like a cutscene and her being like, I am presenting herself as like the ultimate carrion knight. I don't know, giving her like a couple lines of dialogue. You know what I mean? But yeah, you walk into that boss room, it's just like, oh, big mean carrion knight. I've already fought Loretta twice in the base game. I just fought another carrion knight earlier in the DLC to get this big, the big carrion knight great sword, colossal sword, which is pretty cool. You fight another carrion knight before Renala. I was just about to say, I don't know what this is, what it is about the DLC. Maybe it has to do with the Shadow Tree blessing system, but the bringing in 2 summons in the DLC is a death sentence. I played through the base game with my buddies. We did a full playthrough, 2 summons, and it was fine. Like it felt fair, right? It felt scaled properly. Like the bosses definitely got a big, bonus to their health bar, and that was fine. And we still were able to fight and beat these bosses. Messmer felt so broken. And I feel like both my friends were at a point with their Shadow Tree blessing where like they had enough of the Shadow Tree blessing to make this a manageable fight. I just wonder if like the health scaling is like compounded in the DLC because of this new scaling system added on top of the previous scaling system that makes the boss health bars just skyrocket. Like they just feel tremendously larger than the base game for whatever reason, which it is what it is. But Rolana was like, it added to it because we had to, engage with Rolana, and made the fight way longer and made the second phase way longer, which was really actually quite interesting to me. So it added this like element of like, yeah, fighting with my friends against Rolana, this hyper aggro with like, yeah, like I said, wide hitboxes, AoEs, magic, like all those elements that make her maybe boring, made it kind of fun for PvP.
Messmer to me feels like just like a slightly more polished Melania fight, not as maybe annoying as Melania. I think like you said, Messmer totally lives up to the hype and the reputation. Super hard, super challenging fight. Overall, I mean, it's like a boss that I do like. I think I just know that kind of boss is just never going to be my favorite, the Melania Messmer fight.
I also agree, and I think maybe Messmer, it's unfortunate that these other fights exist, like the Rolanas, the Melanias exist, because I think Messmer we might be even more enthused by this fight if it weren't for all the hyper saturation. We're just overly saturated with these types of fights where, because Messmer, it's he also does the same thing where it's like the hyper aggressive 6 to 8 attack combo where you just have to roll. You have to press the B button. You wait. You get a tiny window to get one little attack off before he goes into his next big combo, which I think is actually really well done in the Messmer fight. I think it is oppressive, but once you learn, like I love learning. It's ultimately really rewarding to learn these types of fights. I just think the market is saturated, we could say. There are just so many of these that feel lesser, that it also drags Messmer down a little bit, because we're just like, oh, it's just another, it's another Melania, it's another Rolana, It's another Promise Consort. I mean, Promise Consort. We'll talk about Promise Consort too, but it's the same sentiment of just hyper aggressive. Let's not let the player have any attack windows whatsoever. Let's just force them into this defensive state. Obviously, the comparison here is Sekiro, where
but that kind of thing feels good in Sekiro.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing feels fun and natural in Sekiro.
Exactly. Like it's a 50-50 where, and even some fights you're mostly on the defensive in Sekiro, but the blocks and parries feel really good. They feel really engaging because you're using your katana. You're using Kusabi Maru to, like, you're actively engaged with the enemy. Whereas in Elden Ring, the combat system, it's obviously different. It's like, the traditional Souls-like combat system, which doesn't always necessarily compute with these hyper offensive bosses, where it's like you end up going into these loops of like, okay, now it's time for the boss to just attack me heavy for like 30 seconds straight. So now I just have to roll around or block and ultimately get hit. Eventually, like, getting hit here feels far worse than in Sekiro, where it's like, oh, that's user error in Sekiro, right? Like, getting good with deflecting and being on the defense in Sekiro is super rewarding, whereas with these hyper aggressive bosses in Elden Ring, it just feels bad. It's like, it's fatigue. You're feeling fatigued. In Sekiro, you are energized by parrying and blocking. In Elden Ring, you feel fatigued after fighting, even like Messmer or Radahn for like the 30th time. This war of attrition versus a true battle, which, again, the comparison isn't perfect because Sekiro is its own thing. It's a completely different combat system, but it's hard to, like, go from knowing that From has done that perfectly with Sekiro, and then seeing maybe their sensibilities are, the Sekiro's impact on From. They see the success with those bosses, and it's a little too. It pushes a little too into this combat system that doesn't account for that level of aggression, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, I feel like when I was playing Shadow of the Erdtree, and we all tasted that a little bit with Malenia in the base game, you can almost feel FromSoft hitting like a bit of a ceiling with this combat system if they want to keep pushing in that direction, right? Like, I think they could they could continue to iterate on that Souls formula and give us, like, the Dancing Lion, the Shadow Avatar, Metyr, bosses like that. It's totally fine, and it's fun, and it's cool. And the challenge feels right for the parameters of the combat system. I think with, the Messmer, the Rauh, Promised Consort, Malenia, that's where you feel them bumping against this wall. And on one hand, it's kind of interesting because you can tell these bosses in a way feel very experimental, and that's kind of cool. But then on the other hand, it's like, yeah, but I want to have fun too. And then it's that balance between challenging the player and creating tension and creating a little anxiety and creating a little frustration, but not going so far that you rob the majority of your player base of the fun factor. However, like I said earlier, you have so many tools in Elden Ring that I don't know, but I would imagine you're going to mitigate the challenge of Messmer quite a bit with maybe one summon and a spirit and some of this and some of that. I don't know, but, like, you do have a lot of tools at your disposal to mitigate some of these challenges, but then it kind of becomes something else entirely, though, if they're kind of designing the game with a lot of these tools in mind, where it's like, well, you can obviously beat these bosses without these tools, but we're almost expecting most players will use the tools. And it's like, okay, well, then that kind of changes the equation too. So I don't know. Like, it's an interesting, I feel like FromSoft has hit an interesting point in the road because, when I look at the base game, for example, I really love Morgott as a boss battle. I don't love Malenia. Morgott is my kind of boss. Malenia, not so much. It's not even about, like, Malenia is harder. It's like, well, of course Malenia is harder, but it's kind of the way in which that difficulty is being served to you. And that's why I didn't love Bale, for example. Placiduous Axe is my favorite boss in the base game, and it's such a spectacle and it's fun. It's a challenge, but it's not an oppressive challenge, and it's learnable. And again, it's fun enough and it's enough of a spectacle that I think you enjoy learning it. And Bale, to me, it was like, you start learning the lore and it's like, whoa, they have history. They had, like, this intense battle. Maybe Placiduous Axe is missing heads because of Bale, and it sounds like Bale was mortally wounded by Placidusac. So there's so much hype, and I think you mentioned this earlier. When you first hit Jagged Peak, it's like, whoa, this is incredible. This mountain and the lightning and the red skybox, you're so pumped. And you realize it's just a sequence of spirit springs and cut and paste dragons. And it's like, oh, that's kind of, it's kind of underwhelming. That's not, I almost think it would have been better had there been no dragon fights. If it was just dragon corpses all the way up the mountain, building the tension. The spirit springs are fine. Big spirit jumps are pretty fun. So it's almost like just build the tension, build the tension. And then you get to Bale and it's like, man, this is going to be awesome. I can't wait for this. And then it's like, oh, he's less Placidusax. He's more Royal Rat Authority. I mean, to me, Bale is just like a big hungry slug, just slugging his way to you, trying to eat you. And so I guess it's a matter of expectations. Like if you go in expecting Sin, expecting Calamite, expecting Placidusax, you're going to be disappointed. If you go in thinking like, this is going to be a little more Sif Royal Rat Authority, but tuned to 11 in phase 1, and I know there's like the airborne stuff in phase 2, but it just didn't click with me. I didn't love that fight. Egon's the best part of the whole fight, in my opinion.
I am eager to hear your opinion fighting him another couple times, because he warmed on me. I think I had a similar take during my first playthrough, because there are really unique attack patterns that I think maybe that's kind of to your opinion, in that he is more of the Sith, or like kind of big. He does kind of feel like a big dog in some senses. He's like,
Watchdog of the Old Lords from Bloodborne.
Yeah.
From the Chalice Dungeons.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's kind of a good comp for Bale, right? Maybe it's more of a matter of like, my expectations or the player's expectations versus like, oh, Bale is a bad boss battle. Like, I don't believe that. I didn't have the fun, dynamic experience with Bale that I was hoping for.
Right, because you're expecting something on par of Placidusax, which is also one of my favorite fights from the base game too. So going from Placidusax to something that doesn't quite hit that caliber of dragon boss fight, I can see that being upsetting. That being said, there are some attack patterns that are fun to navigate and try to overcome, much like the lightning patterns of like other dragon bosses. He has some, I guess, more unique ones. Melee attacks he's got a couple unique ones that are kind of fun to dodge and navigate around. So maybe he'll warm on you, maybe he won't, but I think there's still some value to the Bale fight. But I think overall I agree with you that he's a lesser dragon when we've got stuff like Placidusax, and even Fortisax I like quite a bit.
Well, and I think I know it's the Bale bosses that I'm most interested to revisit in a second playthrough. Like, I know, I really enjoy the Metyr and Dancing Lion. I know that, Rolana's not really my thing. Gaius is not my thing, but it's like Bale, it's Messmer, it's those bosses. The bosses where it's like they're not bad, just for my personal taste. Not at the top of my list, but that's why I'm most eager to revisit them, because those are the bosses where I don't feel like I don't understand them quite enough, or like my mind's not fully made up on them. So yeah, that's an interesting part of it. I also want to say something else too. I know you and I were like talking about this, but because there's a few different perspectives on this that are really interesting. There are hard bosses, right? Like, again, compared to most video games, of course, like Shadow of the Erdtree is pretty challenging. But I think a lost aspect of From's games is that it used to be totally fine and even expected to be like quote unquote stuck on bosses. Like that was almost a defining feature of these games. And I do think in this instant 24/7 wiki, YouTube, podcast guide world, people were acting like there was a serious problem if they couldn't easily roll through everything like 48 hours after the DLC came out. And I thought, to me, that is just bizarre. The perspective my Discord moderator had, which I thought was a really good one, is that in this digital age, with a much larger community than used to exist, he made the point where he was like, for him, he's actually trying to hurry through things because he's anxious about having things spoiled for him, because once the game comes out, stuff's just appearing and you can't really control it. And Yeah, like you didn't have to worry about that as much, 10 years ago playing Dark Souls 2 or something. And our algorithms on social media, they all force feed us these spoilers too because the algorithms think we want to see these things. And if you're not careful, you're going to be getting final boss thumbnails from big content creators on release day. And it is a challenge. That is a problem. So I can understand why someone might want to push through and get a little frustrated. It's a tricky thing, but I think I kind of walked away from all of it. It's like, yeah, this is super challenging, but I think the difficulty, while I didn't always personally enjoy it, I think it was a little overblown. And I think people are losing sight of like, okay, like you're stuck on a boss. There's this whole huge map. Go explore it. Don't look at Instagram or YouTube for the next 3 days. Like it's fine.
That's exactly it. Is that typically getting stuck on a boss is typically a flag that you need to go do something else. And that's if you played the base game, which chances are you did because you kind of have to in order to reach the DLC. That's like the whole the whole premise of exploration and Elden Ring is like you'll hit a legacy dungeon or you'll hit like a Morgott, and it's like hey, here's your level check. If you die immediately, well, looks like you didn't quite explore the whole area yet, and you didn't fight the like mini dungeon bosses, and you haven't leveled properly. The DLC, it's, well, I guess you didn't find all the Shadow Tree blessings that are sprinkled out throughout your journey. And if you're engaging with the world, you will find enough Shadow Tree blessings to scale you up to be able to take down bosses in 3 to 4 tries or whatever it is, wherever your skill level's at. The Shadow Trees will level you enough to where your DPS and the amount of damage you're taking feels fair. And yeah, I feel like to what you just said, like a lot of people hit like R'hllana, and they were on like Shadow Tree Blessing 3 or something, and they were like, well, this game is unfair. It's like, well, actually,
yeah, this sucks. This is trash. This isn't even fun. I don't even know what they're thinking. Miyazaki sucks. Exactly. And it's just like, look, you have so many options, right? Yeah, let's say you only got a couple Skadoos with you, and you hit R'hllana, and it's like, well, look, you could stop here. I'm going to be very patient about this. I'm going to learn this boss. I'm going to go in. I'm not even going to try to attack. I'm going to go in and just try to evade, block, whatever I need to do. I'm going to learn this boss. I'm going to be patient. And I know I'll eventually beat the boss. And it could take a week. It could take 2 weeks. It could take 3 days. Like, whatever. Or you go, hey, I kind of don't want to deal with this. I kind of want to just get to the next section of the map. I'm going to summon in some online players and they'll help me do it. Or I'm going to pop a summons and I'm going to do this. Or right, like you said, you just turn around and you go, hey, maybe I'll just keep exploring. And I'm going to mark this boss on the map so I remember where she is. And I'll come back to her in like 10 hours and I'll get some more Skadoos and I'll get some more of this and some more of that. And I'll come back and try it again in 10 hours. So like we were just talking about, there's certain elements of Messmer that I don't love. There's certain elements of Bale I don't love. We'll probably talk about Promised Radahn next, but right, there's some, particularly phase 2. It's like, all right, interesting. But there's always another path. There's always another option. There's always another tool. You can go farm. You can go get more shadow fragments, like you said. That's where I push back on the like, oh, this sucks. This is too hard. This isn't fun. And it's like, again, if this isn't fun to you, go play God of War. Go play Horizon. Go play something else. Like there's lots. And I'm not even putting those games down. I'm just saying, like, if you're playing Shadow of the Erdtree, yeah, and you're like, I don't like this. It's like, okay, maybe you'd like God of War better, or you'd like this game better, or so. Yeah, I just don't get it. That being said, I do think we should talk about Radahn.
I was just about to say, like, I share that sentiment, and honestly, my first playthrough, I definitely got caught up on a couple of these bosses. Died multiple times to them, but by the second playthrough, I think I died like on average like 2 to 3 times per boss, and that's like average, right? There's some bosses that I got first try. Some bosses that took me maybe a little bit longer, but that's like on par. That's like a totally reasonable death count. I don't know. I never experienced a boss that felt fully insurmountable, with the exception of Promised Consort Radahn. The good, bad, and the ugly. I really love the lore implications, and like obviously this is kind of the storyline of the DLC coming to a head. We get to see this revived Radahn in his true, or younger form, his like optimal, Radahn in his glory days is kind of what we're seeing here. The boss arena, I think, is arguably the best boss arena aesthetically in Elden Ring, period. I think it looks so cool. It feels like a final boss arena. From top to bottom, aesthetically, this fight is cool. It feels like the final boss of Elden Ring, period. It does feel like a good cherry on top, visually, lore-wise, the setting, all that's great. The fight itself, though, I complained about Malenia a lot. You know, for base game, her moveset just doesn't feel fair. It just feels like it's on a whole other plane of existence. It feels like you're playing a different game, and like, yeah, it isn't insurmountable. Eventually we all learn how to beat Malenia. We all learn how to either beat Malenia or cheese Malenia, and that's just the way it is. But I never really had like true fun with Malenia. There are highlights. I no longer hate that fight, I don't think, and maybe that's kind of where I'm at with Promised Consort Radahn. I'm in this like honeymoon era of disappointment with Promised Consort Radahn, because of just how it scales. Like I've played through the DLC 3 times now, and every single time I hit Promised Consort, I've been in the fair Shadow Tree Blessing realm. Like typically I think I'm right around 17 or 18. I think the cap is like 20 or something like that. So I'm not like, sure, I missed a couple Shadow Tree fragments, but I don't think that's the issue here. I feel like I'm scaled right. I feel like I should be good going into this fight, but every single time I just get like bodied. Like the level in difficulty from Messmer to Radahn, that spike is just, it feels insane to me. Like it just feels like kind of like Malenia. Like I was saying, we're entering like another game a little bit. Like you have to flip a switch when you hit Promised Consort Radahn. You have to flip a switch a little bit. And it isn't in the same way that like fighting Owl or fighting Ishin or fighting Gale or fighting, you know, Orphan of Kos. Those all feel like it scales right. Like those are the final boss. They're going to be one of the harder bosses in the game, if not the hardest boss in the game. But the experience of going through this DLC, the fights seemingly scale more or less fairly throughout the whole DLC, and then you hit Radahn, and it's like, oh yeah, this is the Malenia fight. This is where I have to like flip a switch in my brain and go from, you know, engaging with bosses even like Messmer, which are on that hyper aggro level, to now I have to play the War of Attrition even further. I have to play this like endurance game of fatigue a little further, and Radahn's moveset is just so hyper oppressive that to me it hits that what you were discussing earlier of just, it's not fun anymore. Like it's this sweaty night fight where you have to just roll through these combos of like literally like 8 to 10 attacks consecutively, and if you get hit you'll get staggered and then you'll get killed. I like learning movesets to some extent, but when it's like you slip up and you have to basically restart the fight again, you start to lose me a little bit. So the difficulty of Radahn, or that spike in difficulty rather at the very end of the game, is kind of what like trips me up a little bit on Radahn. I think the first phase is oppressive. I think learning the first phase is kind of that experience of like learning Owl, learning whatever. And then you hit phase 2 and it feels like, I don't know. There's a disconnect for me hitting phase 2 with Consort Radahn, and it's just a little frustrating. It's a little saddening too. Like I think we all, and maybe this is a separate conversation entirely, but like we're all expecting this fight with Miquella. We were expecting, I don't know, something like a true spectacle, and instead we end up with this weird glitched out version of Lorien and Lothric. You know what I mean? I don't know. I'm still mentally processing my experience with Promised Consort Radahn. It's trying to overcome something that feels impossible in a way that is, you just kind of lose me a little bit.
I think all very fair thoughts, and I think what you are voicing is probably what I would think the majority of players would probably voice. I have a lot of different thoughts about this boss, because again, like you said, even about a month removed from the release of the DLC, and obviously I wasn't fighting Radahn on release day. Yeah, it's a lot to process. So Radahn makes me think a little bit of Manus, actually, and I think either new players don't know or old players forget how difficult Manus is in Artorias of the Abyss. his speed and animations are much more in line with Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 than Dark Souls 1. Like he's almost, you can feel it during the fight. He's almost too fast for the framework of that game. And I don't think we're dealing with a totally dissimilar situation here in Shadow of the Erdtree. Like we were talking about earlier, like that ceiling, you can almost feel them hitting with this combat system in some of these bosses they've designed. I guess one difference with Promised Radahn versus like Gale, Sword Saint, Orphan of Kos is that in this case, you are literally fighting a god. And I think Miyazaki and the team must have wanted it to feel unreasonable for that reason. Like, I guess Gwyn is a god of sorts, but he's pretty diminished when we find him in the kiln at the end of Dark Souls 1. That's very unexpected to me. Like when Ansbach first mentions that Mohg's body has been stolen, and I think you even get a whiff of this Radahn stuff. I can't remember all the quests and when you get certain dialogue and flavor text and when you don't, but you hear about this Radahn business before you get to the gates of divinity. And I like how you're fighting Radahn in his prime, but then not exactly, because he has horns coming from his limbs and he has the blood flame attack. So it's like Mohg's influence is breaking through, like Mohg sort of being this vessel through which Radahn has been resurrected or whatever. And not only from you, I've heard from a handful of people that Radahn, it feels very much like Twin Princes rehashed, and it doesn't feel new enough and surprising enough for a finale, right? Like Elden Beast, we all have, I'd say Elden Beast is a pretty polarizing boss. I'm not a huge fan of Elden Beast. I don't love those battles of attrition where you're just chasing a big tough boss around that can one or two shot you and it takes 7 minutes to beat. Like that's not my kind of fight. But it was very surprising. Nobody saw Elden Beast coming. And From's done that many times. Like Moon Presence is weird. True King Allant and Demon Souls inside of the old one, pretty weird. Like their games usually end weirdly. So the fact that this is, it's like an epic battle against a god, I do think that's kind of cool. And like Radahn was the most powerful of the demigods, we're told. So it does kind of feel fitting that it's this non-rotted version of him. He was this promised consort to Miquella. Mohg coming back into the picture a little bit. Like it does feel kind of fitting, kind of full circle. It's this weird family. Like we're, it's like the last gasp with them. But yeah, I mean, I hear you for sure on the fight and the the fun factor or like the lack thereof. I spent a lot of time I think I might have sent you a video of me fighting this boss. Like I took a lot of time. My goal was to no-hit Radahn, and I almost got there. I took a hit or two in phase 2, and it was like, I'm not gonna die so that I can restart this and try to get a no-hit. I like phase 1. I think phase 1 is intense. It's tough. It's learnable. I think it's pretty fair. Phase 2, though, it does feel to me, and I've heard people say they think Sword Saint is harder than Radahn. I don't agree with that, but everybody has different experiences. I mean, to me, Radahn Phase 2 is the most overwhelming, like stiflingly ridiculous, difficult thing From has ever put in one of their games. Yeah. And it seems to me, it's not like, oops, we accidentally did that. Like that's intentionally what they were out to do. It felt to me that like the secret sauce for Phase 1 was that whatever build you're using, maybe you're casting magic, your melee, whatever, you just need to attack as fast as you can. I think that, that boils down to like increasing your casting speed. So putting points into dex or using talismans that will increase your casting speed, or you're using a melee weapon that requires almost no windup. Like you want to be able to clearly read what Radahn's doing and not spend most of the fight locked into overlong attack animations yourself. Yep. And in general, I liked keeping just a little bit of distance from Radahn in phase 1. And I was actually casting. I was casting faith spells at him real quickly, like just boom, quick flash of light, do some damage, and then I would spend most of my time just watching what he was going to do. I think phase 2, I actually stayed really close, as close to the boss as I could in phase 2. And I feel like everything about phase 2 makes you want to step back. But it felt to me like you were actually safer the more you could hug Radahn. And like, given all the AoE BS that's going on, you really don't want to be too far out. I totally forgot that Marika's Braid is the most powerful item you get at negating holy damage. Totally forgot that it had that function. Once I picked it up, I almost thought it was like a key item or something. I forgot it was an equipable talisman. So I used that like Haligdrake talisman, which basically does the same thing, just not quite as strong. That was my main struggle with this entire fight, was avoiding the AoE chaos in phase 2. I would just get hit by those pillars of light, and it felt like, because I didn't run a lot of vigor, didn't have a ton of HP, so it felt like if I could just tank maybe 2 of these pillars, I could get through the fight. And then I found, like, if I knew I could tank a pillar or 2, and I could try to tune out everything else, his melee swings are not very different in phase 2 than they are in phase 1. And then I found that I could sprint from those like crazy dashes, those repeated like illusory dash attacks. So I would sprint during that. I would stay really close otherwise. Again, like an arcane build, I was leaning into bleed quite a bit, and I found that helped. I even experimented a little bit with like rot pots, like the big rot pots, and those it's kind of ironic, right? With like Radahn, but it's like this is a different Radahn. The big rot pots matter. Staying close to, you can actually stay close to him and jump to avoid that holy nuke. And that's not the first time in Shadow of the Erdtree that I found almost like the development team was encouraging us to use jumping as evading a little bit more. I don't know if you noticed that during your playthrough, but it just felt like, I thought both using shields and jumping felt like not only more viable, but almost like more encouraged alternatives to dodge rolling as a defensive tactic in the DLC.
I was gonna say it's presented to the player kind of right out of the gates with R'hllana, because she's got those 2 super obvious, the big moon AoE, where it's super obvious that you're supposed to jump over that. And I think that's definitely kind of a tell to the player that, like, hey, you could probably use this technique too in other bosses throughout the DLC.
Totally. And I think with the addition of thrusting shields and stuff too, that's one of my hot Elden Ring takes, is that shields are back. Like, shields are cool again. I feel like there were a lot of moments though in Shadow of the Erdtree where it felt like I was almost encouraged to have a shield equipped and use it kind of dynamically in certain situations. And it's probably the most I've used a shield in years playing one of their games. And I didn't manage to no hit phase 2 on the fight that I won. I think I got clipped twice by those AoE pillars. And that's the one part of the fight for me that I do struggle with. Like, yes, you can read some of the AoE stuff, but it does feel like this RNG kind of random roll of the dice where, like, I'm in this location, Radahn is in this location, now the pillars are hitting in this location. Like, a couple times it just felt like, oh, wrong place, wrong time. And then I wondered, the fight that I won and I didn't get hit much, it's like, well, was I just luckier with what I got thrown my way this time? Is that why I won this fight? Whereas if we're talking about Sekiro, like, you're not going to get lucky in Sekiro. You're just going to just get it right. And that's why you're going to win.
Yeah. No, and you mentioned it doesn't feel like, Sekiro, in the sense that, for me, like, I look at the euphoria that I felt finally taking down Owl or Genichiro or, Sword Saint. That sense of euphoria is replaced by this, like, sigh of relief. And I think that's the big difference for me comparing Radahn to these Sekiro fights, is like, I feel obviously with Radahn, like you're just expressing, you have to learn his move patterns. But I think it goes back to, like, what I was saying with, you need to learn them in order to evade them, and you're kind of you're on your back foot the whole time. Whereas in Sekiro, if you get really good at the Ishin fight, or if you get really good at even like Genichiro, you're on the, like, offensive. Even though you're deflecting, you're still pressing forward into the boss at all times, and you don't have to feel like with Radahn. I always felt like I was on the back foot, and I think maybe I just need more experience. Granted, it's been a month, but we've only, you're fresh off of 1 playthrough. I've done 3 playthroughs, but I don't feel confident with Radahn yet. That being said, Sekiro, I've only done 2 playthroughs of, and I just feel like you feel rejuvenated. You feel that, again, euphoria, I think is the perfect feeling. Like, I haven't felt that rush of, like, taking down Genichiro or Owl or Ishin, that you just feel so accomplished and so just like, that was so worth my time. Whereas taking down Radahn, each time I took down Radahn, it was like, thank God that's over. You know what I mean? Like Ishin, like leaving Ishin, you're like, I feel so rewarded. I'm glad I did that. Radahn, it's like I'm glad it's over. And that's just, it's unfortunate because it's the final boss. you're the final cutscene's very mid too. We can talk about that too, I guess, a little bit. But to me, it was just like, I want to love this boss. I sung its praises for aesthetics and lore, but I just it's hard to process this being the final boss of Elden Ring. Considering how Orphan of Kos is just it's perfect. Looking at Gale, that's also one of my top favorite bosses of all time. And looking at the base game final bosses, like, I don't love the what's it called, Soul of Cinder. Like, it's a fine fight, it's fine. But like Gale is like, I feel like the final boss of a DLC needs to be the cherry on top, and I'm just not quite sure if Radahn does that for me. I guess that's just kind of how I'm feeling right now.
I felt that way with a few bosses. Like, I absolutely hated the Golden Hippo. I thought it was trash. It was just another charging boss. I wanted to like it because it looks really cool, kind of like Gaius, right? This big armored knight on like a warthog. I hated it, so there were a few fights like that where it was like, let's just get this over with. And then, right, thank God it's done. Radahn was, and that could just be, the sweaty, try-hard part of my brain that still exists, where it's just like, oh, it's the final boss in the DLC, and it's like the hardest thing. Oh, I have to solo it. I have to learn. Like, I'm sure there's like some competitive, egotistical pride kicking in where it's like, nah, I'm gonna like no hit the hardest boss. Of course I am. But yeah, I certainly would not put Radahn on like a Gale, Sword Saint, Orphan of Kos level. I wouldn't even put Radahn on a Ivory King level. I mean, I will say this, because I fought Radahn so many times. Something about, like, you did a good job describing that arena, which I thought was very interesting in the trailer. The arena felt very alive, those gates of divinity. It kind of feels like, something about it feels vaginal or like a birthing canal or something. It's very interesting. And then, they're like the two columns of it. You also wonder, like, two fingers. There's a lot of twos in the game. But I know a lot of people were like, oh, this looks like the blasphemous blade. Like, it's all fleshy and alive. And then when we get there in the game, it's like fossilized and stony and dead. I thought that was kind of interesting. But like, yeah, that arena, it's so cool. The music, so epic. So I think it's like, I just spent so much time fighting the boss that I do have like an odd attachment to the boss. And I think it'll just stick with me forever. But that's not me saying like, oh, it's my again, I like listed my favorite bosses. This isn't one of them. I don't put it on the Gale level. And I think for me, it's, I think I said this on my Discord server too, like, we often talk about the dance when we talk about great FromSoft bosses. There's a dance to Sword Saint, there's a dance to Gale, etc., etc. Radahn Phase 2 is more of like a mosh pit than a dance. Like, it's just crazy. What's interesting in why Sekiro is so special, I think it's the greatest combat system ever designed in a video game, because it's so tight, it's so confined, and as a result, you do lose freedom. You cannot experience the freedom in a game like Sekiro that you can experience in a game like Elden Ring. That's why it's so cool both exist from the same studio, because it's a lot of the same ideas thematically. It's a lot of the same gameplay principles, but they're served to you in entirely different systems. And because Elden Ring and the Souls games and Bloodborne, etc., like, they're so much more open and free, that allows for that exciting experimentation and creativity. And I think it also lets in a few bad things. Like, there's more room for the jankiness. There's more room for, I don't know if this feels great. Whereas everything in Sekiro exists within the confines of that game. Sekiro is like a very singular experience. Like, it exists in a vacuum. It's really interesting in that way. And I think, yeah, like, we're seeing with Elden Ring and even further with Shadow of the Erdtree, like, them hitting this kind of Souls ceiling where it's like, if you guys want to keep doing these kinds of bosses, you might need to design a new combat system, kind of like Sekiro had. But I'm always going to enjoy those boss battles where there's a little more breathing room. So it does feel less like a mosh pit and more like a dance, like Sword Saint, like Gale, like Frida, like, whatever, like all these great bosses. It's interesting. It's very interesting, and it's upset a lot of people, and it's got a lot of people talking and stating opinions, and I don't know that any of it's bad. I think it's kind of interesting to see them from like bumping against this ceiling, and it makes me even more curious, like seeing things like Promised Radahn, seeing things like the Abyssal Woods. What the hell is the next game looking like? What are they doing? What fat are they trimming? What strengths are they leaning more into? I just have no idea what's next for them.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good note to end it on. Is what does Shadow of the Erdtree mean for the future of FromSoft games? I think it was ultimately, we went through all of our small little nitpicky criticisms of it, but as a whole, it does feel like a fantastic way of concluding our time with Elden Ring, and also, as you were just expressing, a really interesting point to now start looking forward again. Like, I remember when we first met, we were super hyped on Elden Ring. That's how we met, and we were constantly looking towards this new project from Software, and we were reflecting upon everything we loved about Sekiro and everything we loved about Dark Souls 3. And now we're doing this, we're in the exact same spot for whatever's coming next for From Software, and yeah, I couldn't be more stoked looking forwards towards the future of these games, because I truly think that Miyazaki, and he even expressed in a recent interview, he's nowhere near finished, and we're nowhere near his greatest game of all time. So that being said,
yeah, like the day Shadow of the Erdtree came out, that quote was floating around from him where he's like, I think I could make a much better game than this, which is the most Miyazaki thing ever to say. And I'm also encouraged by his stuff about how just because Elden Ring was a huge game and a huge commercial success, he in no way is married to like, oh, big open fields, open world. Like, it sounds to me like he almost wouldn't mind making a smaller, kind of tighter, more linear game. And I would feel like, boy, wouldn't that be a nice, if this was the inhale, wouldn't that be a nice exhale of, or vice versa, of maybe the next game? It has a unique combat system, a little different than Souls, and it's a smaller game. Maybe it's kind of like Sekiro or Bloodborne. It's not super long. That would be refreshing after this crazy Elden Ring ride. But no, I'm just, us talking about this has me even more excited to go back in for my second playthrough. I'm gonna do the dry leaf weapons for my second playthrough, and I'm super excited.
Hell yeah. I've been looking forward to talking to you about the DLC as much as I have actually playing the DLC, so glad we both got to kind of offload some thoughts about the DLC, and yeah, thanks again for having me.
Long ago, we began as stardust, born of a great rupture far across the skies. We too are children of the greater will. Is that not divine? Is that not sublime? And yet, none can fathom its implications. I fear that you have borne witness to the whole of it. The conceits, the hypocrisy of the world built upon the Erdtree. The follies of men. Their bitter suffering. Is there no hope for redemption? The answer, sadly, is clear. There never was any hope. They were each of them defective, unhinged from the start. Marika herself, and the fingers that guided her. And this is what troubles me. No matter our efforts, if the roots are rotten, then we have little recourse. Ever-young Miquella saw things for what they were. He knew that his bloodline was tainted, his roots mired in madness. A tragedy if ever there was one. That he would feel compelled to renounce everything when the blame lay squarely with the mother. The fingers are but unripe children, victims in their own right. We all need a mother, do we not? A new mother. A true mother who will not give birth to further malady.